language, which is what Lakota, Dakota, Nakota is a part of the Siouan language, has a grammatical structure to it that is found in indigenous languages all over the Western Hemisphere. And so what this tells us is that, and I believe there is archaeological evidence for this, is that prior to Columbus's first voyage, there was a lush and vast civilization in the Western Hemisphere of indigenous people. There were many villages and cities, sometimes sizable cities, with remarkably sophisticated trade routes and transportation routes. And so we went back and forth and traveled and traded with each other all up and down the Western Hemisphere. It's pretty amazing when you think of it, especially when you think of it in terms of the Columbus discovery narrative, which says that there was basically nothing here before Columbus set sail, or at least nothing worth acknowledging. And what goes along with that is the concept of terra nullius, just nothing on the earth that was here before it was discovered. And we know that discovery was not something that actually happened. It's a narrative that interprets history. And I'll get to that in a little while. One of the things that people say to me all the time is, gee, you don't look Indian. I hear that quite a bit. So much that I don't take offense at it anymore, really. But interestingly enough, no indigenous person has ever said that to me. Only non-indigenous people have said that to me. Because we know our own. We know our own. We can tell who an indigenous person is. And I can do that. If an indigenous person walks into a room, I can kind of tell it. I can feel it. I can feel that there are some here who do have some indigenous ancestry somewhere in your background. And some of you might not even be aware of that. But there's a reason that I don't look Indian. Because my family has been assimilated. And this goes back to the mid-1800s. The assimilation process that was enacted by the federal government and churches through boarding schools. Both of my parents were raised in boarding schools. My father was raised in a federal government-operated boarding school in Pine Ridge. He was taken there at age 5 and lived there until 18. So 13 years, basically most of his childhood and his adolescence was spent in a boarding school. My mother was raised in an Episcopal boarding school. Our denomination operated them as well. St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian Girls in Springfield, South Dakota, is where she grew up. So what happened in these boarding schools was they were assimilated. Indigenous children were taken from their families, or sometimes their families took them there because there were no other schools around for them. And they essentially grew up to learn how to live and identify with and operate within the dominant culture of the general population of America, which was European influenced and dominated. So it was an unlearning process with regard to being indigenous, and a learning process with regard to becoming Euro-American, or for lack of a better term, white, which meant giving up the indigenous language, giving up the indigenous culture and ways, and learning a different way of living. That's what happened in these boarding schools. When we think of boarding schools, sometimes we think of the elite schools on the East Coast and in some other parts of the country where children of privilege go. And indigenous boarding schools were a very different thing. Probably the thing I could best compare them to would be internment camps for children. So, with both of my parents being raised in boarding schools, they were they were taken from their families. And so their family consisted of everybody who was living at the school, at the institution. The result of that was that I never knew my grandparents. I never knew my grandparents. I barely knew my aunties and uncles and my cousins because we were kept apart for so long that we didn't know who we were. And that was done intentionally as part of the Indigenous child removal and assimilation process. They wanted to take us from our families and our extended families because that's where our culture and language and spirituality were learned, within that family context. So the best way to assimilate an Indigenous child into American society was to remove them from that context and place them in a different one in which they could learn how to be a typical white American. But what that did was that devastated our family relationships. And there were a lot of mental health problems that resulted from that Indigenous people have experienced to this day. I'm standing here in front of you as one of the people who's gone through that. I've led a pretty mixed up life. I've had a lot of problems interpersonally and intrapersonally. I've been in just about every kind of therapy you can imagine. My family was very dysfunctional growing up in it because I had two parents who didn't know how to raise a family because they weren't raised in a family context themselves. They didn't know how to do it. And they tried the best that they could. I really believe that, but there was so much that they didn't know, so much that they hadn't experienced. And so I grew up from the very beginning feeling like I was different from everybody else. I wasn't raised on a reservation. I was raised within a white community, born and raised in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and then Rapid City on the other side of the state. And that was because my father got a job at the federal government, which moved him off of the reservation into Sioux Falls and then Rapid City. He was transferred there. So I grew up in essentially white communities. And I had white friends at school. I went to public school, and I'd go over to their homes to visit and have supper sometimes, and I observed the way that they interacted with each other and how nice their homes looked, and that wasn't the case with me. That wasn't the case with me at all. I was actually embarrassed and ashamed to ask my white friends over to my house for a meal or to play a game or anything like that, because it felt so inferior. It felt so different. And there were some situations in which, when people found out that we were Indigenous, had an adverse reaction. My younger brother and I have a brother who's a year younger than me. It was quite common for us to be bullied at school. My brother first, because he was younger and he was more vulnerable, and so I would see him getting beaten up and tormented at school, and so I'd be his bodyguard and help him out and try to protect him, so I'd get beaten up too. It came to the day when my mother was so fed up with it that she went down to the school and talked to the principal and complained and said, what can be done about this? And this was the 1970s when this happened, the 1970s. And the principal, again, this is a public school in a small town in South Dakota. The principal basically told my mom, well, there are a couple things you can do. Find another school for your sons to go to, or have them stay home and be homeschooled. Those were the options. So we decided to just stay put and put up with it. And it was very painful. It was very difficult going to school, not knowing whether or not you were going to get beaten up and not have anybody help you. So we were, I think I'm not saying this too strongly, my brother and I were traumatized in public school just for being who we were. And it got to the point where my parents eventually told me, don't tell anybody that you're Indian. If anybody asks you what your race is or your ethnicity, just say white. Because I do have a European ancestry in me, as most Indigenous people do. And I can pass for white pretty easily, so They said, just say you're white. It's not worth the hassle to say that you're Indian. And so that's what I did. I started doing that. I started telling everybody that I was white, and if it was ever brought up whether or not I was Indian or part Indian, I always denied it. And that always felt wrong to me to do. I was denying a part of me that I knew was a significant part of me and my identity. And as I got older, I grew more comfortable with re-embracing my indigenous heritage. But there was a time in my life when I almost forgot about it and denied it altogether. You know that part in the Gospels where Peter denies Jesus 3 times? Not the exact same situation, but it felt like that. Because when I would deny it, I would cry, if not outwardly, inwardly. I would start to weep because I knew it wasn't true, that I am indigenous. But it took me a while to be able to acknowledge that and feel safe. So here I am in Kansas City, the home of the Kansas City Chiefs. Congratulations on the Super Bowl victory, by the way. I am a football fan. I am. My favorite teams have changed over the years. I grew up in Rapid City, South Dakota, where I spent most of my time growing up. We didn't have a football team. The closest one was Denver, so the Denver Broncos were my favorite football team. You can all boo if you want to. And then I did something that the Denver fans really didn't like. I married a woman who was a Green Bay Packers fan. You can boo even more than that. And so because I did that, I had to become a Green Bay Packers fan. It was practically in the wedding vows that I would do that. It just wasn't going to work out for me to not be a Packers fan, and so I had to switch loyalties there. But just a little bit of information about chiefs, if you don't know. For indigenous people, the term chief, that's not really an indigenous term. That really does not come from our culture or our society. Many people think it does, that it refers to our leaders. There is no word for chief, really, in any indigenous language. That's a colonized term. It really, I believe, comes from English roots or maybe French roots, meaning for someone who's a leader of a country or an organization, you know, chief executive officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer. In my tribe, Oglala Sioux tribe, we had leaders. The term for the leader was itancha. Itancha. And that just meant the leader of the tribe. Now, the itancha, they were essentially just guys with good ideas. They had good ideas, and so people would follow them. And when their good ideas ran out, which they did, then they were run out of the role, and somebody else replaced them. So itancha was never anything that was ontological in nature or permanent. It just had to do with somebody that people wanted to follow at the time. Didn't last for very long. In fact, in some cases, there was the itancha du jour. Itancha for the day there. And they didn't wear these headdresses with all those feathers in them. When we see the photographs from the 19th century, early 20th century, we see that. We see a photo of, let's say, Chief Red Cloud or Chief Crazy Horse or Chief Black Elk, and they're all dressed up in regalia. Well, that was because it was a special occasion. They would only do that ceremonially or for photographs. For one thing, all that regalia is really uncomfortable to wear. It's heavy. Oh my goodness. One of those headdresses could be up to 25 pounds or more. So it was only on rare special occasions that chiefs or Itansha would dress up like that. Otherwise, they looked just like the average person as they went about their business. So the understanding of who an Indian chief is, according to the dominant society here in America, and the understanding of an Itansha or a leader for indigenous people are very different from each other. They're not one and the same. So just for you to be aware of that, the term chief really reflects more of the dominant society than it does indigenous people. We can talk a little bit about that later if you like. Before I go any further, just a little bit about the structure of our time together. We're on until 4, right? So what we thought we'd do is we'd go initially this morning until noon and have lunch. Okay. When the food is ready, we'll go in there and we'll have lunch for about 40 minutes or so. And then we'll come back here and then we'll do some more of the presentation. And then we'll do a break when it feels like we need to have a break. You know, when it feels like we need to have a break, we'll go have a break and then come back and be done by 4 o'clock. So that's what we're looking at. How does that sound? Wonderful. Well, let's pray. This is called the Gathering Prayer. And it was written by indigenous people in the Episcopal Church back in the 1980s. And I hope you all can see it. And those of you who can see it, I invite you to pray it out loud with me. Creator, we give you thanks for all you are and all you bring to us for our visit within your creation. In Jesus, you place the gospel in the center of this sacred circle through which all of creation is related. You show us the way to live a generous and compassionate life. Give us your strength to live together with respect and commitment as we grow in your spirit, for you are God, now and forever. Amen. There's a typo in there. It should be live instead of love. But you can love a generous and compassionate life too. In this prayer are a number of indigenous values that are mentioned. Relationship. The sacred circle. The circle is the most prominent and sacred symbol in indigenous communities. It represents eternity. It represents relationship. It represents a way of connecting us all to one another. No beginning and no end. It's infinite. Generosity and compassion are two very core indigenous values, especially generosity. It's been said that if you're not generous, you're not indigenous, regardless of your ancestry. Indigenous people are, by the very core of our culture and our society, generous people. We're always concerned about the good of the whole and not individual achievement. If we're going to initiate something, take some kind of action, we consider how it's going to affect subsequent generations before we do anything. We don't look at what we can get out of it in the immediate moment. And yes, there is a tradition in indigenous culture where if you happen to visit a person's house and like something there, like a work of art that's on the wall or a statue or some pottery or beadwork or something, and if you make some kind of remark about liking it, that the indigenous person will feel an obligation to give it to you. And that includes anything that's worn, you know, any jewelry that might be worn, rings or bracelets. If you remark to an indigenous person how much you like it, that person will feel obligated to give it to you because of generosity being so much a part of our core values. There's a joke that goes along with that. That indigenous man was in a gathering, and there were a number of people there who were admiring what he was wearing. He was decked out in all this great beadwork and turquoise and all these wonderful things. And so people came up to him and said, gee, that's a really beautiful ring, or that's a really beautiful bracelet. And so he'd take it off and give it to them. And that's a beautiful necklace. And so he'd take his necklace off and give it to them. And then he immediately left the room. And as he was leaving, somebody asked him, why are you leaving, my brother? And he said, I got to get out of here before somebody admires my trousers. But that really is the way it is. So how do we deal with that in the indigenous culture? We usually don't express admiration for something that somebody wears or that's in somebody's house, because we don't want to have them feel like they're obligated to give it to us necessarily. Sometimes we do, sometimes we don't. We're judicious about it. We don't exploit that tradition. So generosity is significant. Now, the gathering prayer can be found in a disciple's prayer book, as can be a rule of life for indigenous people. And I have down there the citation, A Disciple's Prayer Book, Office of Indigenous Ministries. My office gives those out. If you're interested in getting one, let me know, email me, and I can send you Disciples' Prayer Books for free. Within them, you'll find the gathering prayer, you'll find daily Bible studies and meditations, and then the rule of life. So let's go through this. In Jesus, we know we belong to a sacred circle with the gospel and baptismal covenant in the center. The center. And we revolve around that. That governs us. That's the most important focal point. The gospel and baptismal covenant. And in this sacred circle, we are all related. We live a compassionate and generous life. We respect all life traditions and resources. We commit ourselves to spiritual growth, discipleship, and consensus. Mitakwasi, which we said earlier, mitakwasi, together, all my relatives. And some of us have been living our lives under this rule. But if you haven't, I mean, think of how it would change you and change your world if you did. I talked a little earlier about how to refer to indigenous people. And I use that term indigenous, and it's the title of my office, the Office of Indigenous Ministries. The office didn't used to have that name. It was, I believe, the first of the ethnic offices that was established by the Episcopal Church back in 1954. 1954. And the first missioner was a priest named Vine Deloria Sr., the Reverend Vine Deloria Sr., who was the father of Vine Deloria Jr. Some of you may have heard of him. A well-known indigenous author, attorney, activist, Vine Deloria Jr. His dad was the first missioner, my predecessor, back in 1954, before I was born. But I knew Vine Deloria Sr. I did, when he was an elder. He was a friend of my folks, and every now and then he would call the house and want to talk to my mom or want to talk to my dad. He usually wanted to talk to my mom. I think he liked my mom. And I would answer the phone, and I was just maybe 5 years old or something like that. And I would answer the phone like a 5-year-old would answer the phone, you know, very innocently, hello. And then there'd be this big booming voice on the other end that would say, who is this? And it would scare me. It was Vine Deloria Sr. wanting to talk to one of my folks. He frightened me so much I cried. He did. And I'd say to my mother, Mom, there's a scary guy on the phone. He wants to talk to you. Don't talk to him. Well, that was my predecessor. I'd like to think that I'm not quite that scary today. At that time, anyway, the office was known as the Office of American Indian Ministries. But then that changed to the Office of American Indian and Alaska Native Ministries, because the Alaskan tribes felt left out of it. But then that didn't seem inclusive enough, and so it was called the Office of Native American Ministries. But then, as I said before, that term Native American is problematic. It's not universal. It's just referring to indigenous people in the Americas. And as we know, the Episcopal Church is an international denomination, right? We're found in a number of different nations. So we're not an American church per se. So that term didn't quite fit. And so we decided to adopt a more universal term, indigenous. Indigenous is a universal term, and it fits well for our international church. So we go by the United Nations definition of indigenous, taken from the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And that definition is communities, peoples, and nations which, having a historical continuity with pre-invasion and pre-colonial societies that developed on their territories, consider themselves distinct from other sectors of the societies now prevailing on those territories or parts of them. That's quite a definition, isn't it? It reads like one of Paul's letters. You know, it just keeps going and going and going and going. Okay, at some point the sentence is going to end here. I'm not sure where, but it basically means a people who have been colonized. Not necessarily a people who have lived someplace for a long period of time. And not really in the same sense as we consider, indigenous wildlife or vegetation or trees, something that just naturally grows or lives in a particular area for a long period of time. It can have that type of element as well, but it requires colonization in order to be known as indigenous according to the United Nations. And so that's how we see it. So that's what I mean by indigenous people. It certainly applies to the indigenous tribes here in the United States and the First Nations of Canada. People who were here and then colonized by another nation or nations. And there are indigenous people all over the world, not just in the Western Hemisphere. They're found on all continents of the world, except maybe Antarctica. I don't know if there are any there or not. I'm not sure why there would be, but other places, even Europe, there are indigenous people in Europe. The Sami people, sometimes known as Laplanders, in extreme northern Scandinavia and Russia and out by the Arctic Circle. The indigenous people there they're Caucasian, at least that's how they're classified racially, but they are considered to be indigenous. And if they were Episcopalian, they would fall under the umbrella of my Office of Indigenous Ministries. But that has not motivated me to make a trip to the Arctic Circle to try to do evangelism. So that's what I mean by indigenous. Now, just before lunch, what I'd like to do is just take a look at some world views. Indigenous and Judeo-Christian American worldviews. I want to give you an example of what life was like before Columbus. So pre-Columbian indigenous life, the traditional way of living according to indigenous people. There are hundreds of indigenous tribes on Turtle Island or North America. That's what indigenous tribes knew North America as, was Turtle Island. That's what we called North America. In what is currently known as the United States alone, there are over 570 tribes. Over 570. So it's not just the Sioux and the Cherokee, or the Sioux and the Cherokee and the Navajo. over 570 of them. And these tribes have different languages, as I said, different dialects within the languages, different traditions, creation myths, and social practices. I kind of look at it the way that you would look at Europeans, who are all Europeans. But there's a big difference between a Norwegian and an Italian in a number of different ways. So you can't look at them as the same just because they're both European. You have to look at the differences. But there are some perspectives that are held in common, I think pretty much universally across indigenous tribes. For one, indigenous worldviews and religions are inextricably grounded in the natural world. The earth, geology and geography, weather, plant, and animal life. The natural world is centrally featured in creation stories and myths, and the social archetypes and ethics are based on it. Judeo-Christian worldviews, on the other hand, tend to be grounded in special revelation or scriptures, doctrines and dogmas or narratives of some kind. Now, that is not to say that there is no place in Judeo-Christian worldviews for the natural world and creation. We do find that mentioned in a number of cases. We have a number of spiritual writers and theologians who've written about creation theology, and I think Paul in Romans chapter 1 talks about how the glory of God is revealed in creation. So it's not that that's not found in Judeo-Christian worldviews. It just isn't emphasized as much as it is within indigenous worldviews. For example, if you were to ask someone coming from the Judeo-Christian tradition, and this varies in degree depending on the denomination, if you were to ask such a person, how do you know the ways of God? How do you know the ways of God? They would probably say, open up the Bible. Look at the scriptures, read the scriptures, soak in the scriptures, and you'll learn the ways of God from that. But if you were to ask an indigenous person that question, they would probably tell you, go outside, be outdoors, observe, learn about what's happening there, and you'll know the ways of God. That's the difference. But, again, it's not that that type of worldview is not found in Judeo-Christianity. In fact, in some instances, it is very profoundly exemplified within Christianity and the Gospels, the teachings of Jesus. Jesus said, if you want to know about how to live a faithful life, look at the birds. Look at the birds and how they live, how God takes care of them. Learn from them. They are your teachers. If you want to know whether or not we can feel safe and secure about the future, look at the trees and what's happening with them. And they will teach you. You can learn from them. So Jesus, in some ways, had an indigenous worldview. He did. In fact, I'm becoming more and more convinced that Jesus must have been Lakota. Why not? I mean, that's exactly what our elders would have taught us. There is a passage in the Gospels. Remember the passage where Jesus curses a fig tree? Where I think he's between Bethany and Jerusalem, and it's in the morning, and he's hungry, and he sees a fig tree, and he's thinking he can get some figs to eat on there, and so he's over there, and he finds that there aren't any figs. And he's mad, and he curses the tree. He said, "You'll never bear fruit again." For years, I didn't know what the heck to do with that passage. I avoided that passage as much as I could. I never preached on it. Wasn't quite sure how to interpret it. And you can interpret it as meaning, do we bear fruit or not in our lives? But looking at that passage from an indigenous perspective makes perfect sense, because if the tree is the relative of Jesus, then Jesus has a relationship with that tree. And if Jesus is a teacher and in the role of the elder, then Jesus in the role of the elder has an obligation to teach and to give critical feedback to another relative. That's how indigenous society works. And what the indigenous elders do is they do that. Sometimes they will go out of their way to give critical feedback to somebody if they think that person isn't behaving up to standard, isn't behaving up to expectations. And the elder will approach that person and read them the riot act. That's just what they do. That's their role. It's expected. And so this passage of Jesus cursing the fig tree is Jesus, the indigenous elder, correcting a relative. It makes perfect sense from an indigenous perspective. And that just goes to show how, and I'll talk about this a little later after lunch, our Christianity can be more greatly informed and enriched by looking at Jesus from an indigenous lens, as opposed to the lens that we may have been used to in our lives up to this point. Indigenous people see Jesus a little differently, and we can too. Indigenous worldviews and religions do not recognize a dichotomy of material and spiritual facets of life. Everything is spiritual. Everything is alive. Everything is spiritual. Everything is alive. This podium is spiritual and alive. Why? Because at one point it was a tree. It still is, it's just in a different form. Same thing with the pews and the floor here. Everything really comes from the earth. And because the earth is alive, everything is alive. And because the Great Spirit is a source of everything on earth, everything has a spiritual facet or nature to it. There can't be anything that's not spiritual if it's created by God. I mean, how could that be? How could there be a dichotomy like that? Well, Christianity tends to teach that there is a dichotomy, and what is material is inferior to what is spiritual. Seek the things that are spiritual, we're taught. When in fact, the material can teach us a lot that we may need to know spiritually. So because everyone and everything is spiritual in nature, there is also no dichotomy of sacred and secular in indigenous worldviews. Everything is sacred. Again, if God is the source of everything, how could it not be sacred? It doesn't make sense. Christianity teaches such a dichotomy, and separation of church and state is a basic principle in American government and society. That's always been foreign to indigenous people. We've never understood that dichotomy, that binary way of looking at it, spiritual and unspiritual, spiritual and material. When in politics, if you were to go to a reservation during election time and see the political ads in the newspaper or on the internet for candidates who are running for the tribal council for a particular reservation council, they're listing their qualifications, as candidates typically do. But among indigenous people, it's not at all uncommon. In fact, it's normative for them to talk about their spiritual life as they campaign. And with the understanding that their devotion to their spiritual life qualifies them for public service. You see that quite a bit. Candidates saying, I walk the red road. I walk with the Great Spirit. I try to lead a balanced life in harmony with the Great Spirit in all of creation. Therefore, I am qualified to be one of your leaders. You don't really see that here in the United States, do you? During the political debates and the political ads, And we can get into a whole other conversation about that, but we don't have time for it. But that's how Indigenous people see it. Indigenous worldviews see everything in the cosmos as equal and related. We are all relatives: people, animals, plants, rocks, stars and planets, the weather, etc. Nothing is disconnected from anyone or anything else. Plants and animals are typically referred to as people. In my house where I live, I have several trees, and I have names for them because they're tree people. They're my relatives. And in some ways, they're smarter than me, these trees, because in Minnesota, when winter comes along and the weather's below zero for weeks at a time, they know how to survive. You know, they're still around and they blossom again come the next spring and summer. They can get through the winter without wearing any clothes. I couldn't do that. I'd freeze to death out there, but they don't. So I see that as they're being smarter than me. They're tree people. Now, Christianity does not teach this, really, and furthermore teaches that there is a hierarchy in life, with humans at the top because they are made in God's image. In the Judeo-Christian tradition, humans are entrusted with dominion over the rest of creation. Indigenous worldviews and religions do not teach human dominance. Do not teach human dominance. We're taught that we have a place in the universe. The Great Spirit has given us a place, but it's not to be in control of it or try to be in control of it. It's not to have dominance. It's to know our place and live there and stay there, living in balance and harmony with the rest of creation, with everything else. And that's how Indigenous people lived for centuries, for millennia, even longer than that. And the result of that is that they knew how to survive in some of the most horrible situations. In the Pacific Northwest, the things that Indigenous people were able to do with their relatives, the salmon, helped them to survive. Otherwise, they would have starved to death. On the Great Plains, the Lakota, Dakota, Nakota people, the things that they learned to do with living in cooperation with the bison, with the buffalo, helped sustain them, keep them from starving to death, and it kept them warm in the horrible, difficult winters. So they knew what it takes to survive and to survive in balance and harmony with the rest of the cosmos because they knew their place and they didn't try to go beyond those boundaries. And what do we see today in our world? We see what's happening as a result of humans going beyond their boundaries, not knowing their place and staying there, but exerting dominance over the rest of creation. And that upsets the sacred balance, the sacred harmony that the Great Spirit put in place. So what do we see happening? Pollution, global warming, carbon footprint, this wacky weather that we've been experiencing, garbage all over the place, fish and ocean life poisoned by mercury, huge mountains of garbage floating around in the oceans, space debris, junk out there orbiting the Earth in space. There's even space debris on Mars right now, our discarded equipment, our rover equipment that's not working anymore on Mars. We just leave it up there, because we have to. There's nothing else we can do. But we haven't even set foot on Mars yet, and already our garbage is there. It has preceded us. That's what happens when humans try to exert dominance. Now, you can look at it from the perspective of, okay, what does dominance mean? And you could, from the Judeo-Christian tradition, understand dominance as responsibility. to be a good steward, as opposed to taking control and exploiting the environment for our own good. But so often that does not happen. The indigenous worldviews and religions do not see anything fundamentally wrong with people. There is no concept of original sin. Indigenous worldviews and religions recognize good and bad behavior with resulting consequences, and values and ideals as well. But there is no intrinsic sin within people that needs to be atoned for or forgiven, which is very central to the Judeo-Christian worldview. Christianity tends to be sin-based, whereas indigenous worldviews and religions are virtues-based. And again, it's not that virtues don't have a place in the Judeo-Christian tradition. They do. We have a number of people who have taught about them and written about them. So virtues have a place, absolutely. But so much of Christianity has been based in sin, or the belief that there's something fundamentally wrong with us from birth that needs to be atoned for. So when the early missionaries came to the indigenous people and started teaching that, indigenous people just couldn't get their minds around it. How could that be if we're a creation of the Great Spirit who is all good? You know, how can there be something fundamentally wrong with us that needs to be atoned for? Now, there are other religions that don't believe in original sin either. I think Islam does not believe in original sin. But for indigenous people, that was a big stumbling block in becoming Christian, was having to accept that. But we found a way of doing it, and it has to do with a different way of interpreting Christ's death on the cross. It's not just atonement for sin, not the satisfaction theory of the atonement, but for Jesus demonstrating to us the ultimate act of generosity in giving his life for the whole world. So we have a little different understanding of the death of Christ. And then indigenous religion is centered in and practiced within the community as a whole and not in a separate institution, unlike the Christian church. So people did not go to church, quote unquote. Instead, spiritual ceremonies were a part of ordinary community and tribal life. So they were out there in the town square, the village square, and everybody participated in them. While there were and are shamans, prophets, and elders, they had lived and practiced within the community and have not been organized separately or in any hierarchical way. They don't have titles. They don't dress in a certain way. Or they don't have an office anywhere. So if you go into an indigenous community and want to see the shamans, the prophets, and the elders, the makers of medicine, you would not recognize them. If you saw them, you'd have to ask the people there, who are they? And how can I visit them? Because they just blend in with everyone else. Is it almost lunchtime?
Yeah, they're ready.
Are they ready? Okay. Why don't we do lunch and then come back and look at other indigenous worldview and societal contrasts. Continuing with indigenous worldview and societal contrasts where we left off, this is a photo of a guy named Dakota Goodhouse. And it was taken on the Standing Rock Reservation up in North Dakota at Camp Gabriel, which is the youth camp up there on the Standing Rock Reservation in the Episcopal Church. And we had our Native Youth event there a couple of years ago, and he was a speaker on how indigenous people see the land and our relationship with it. It was very, very informative. I do want to go back. I didn't point out to you, this piece of artwork here was done by an indigenous artist named Robert Tubles. He's an Episcopal priest. And it is a replica of Powhatan's mantle. Powhatan was the Tancha, or the chief, at Jamestown and interacted with the settlers at the Jamestown colony. And he had a mantle that he would wear from time to time ceremoniously, and it looked like that. That's not the original one. It's a replica. The original one, I think, is in a museum in England. But it's a buffalo hide with the artwork on it. Powhatan was an Algonquin, leader of an Algonquin tribe. And so that's what that is. This replica currently hangs at the Diocesan Center in South Dakota, the Diocese of South Dakota. So that's replica of Powhatan's mantle. So just finishing up with some worldviews and contrasts. Many indigenous communities were matriarchal in their organization, with females being the heads of households. The men traditionally were the hunters, gatherers, and warriors, but the women organized the villages and were in charge of the households. In fact, that's almost universal. I think it could be not just many, but all were matriarchal in their organization and matriarchal in the understanding of their ancestry. You know, in the Bible, we have in Genesis and then in Matthew, you have these genealogy charts where it's a genealogy of Jesus in Matthew and then in Luke, and then you find those in some of the Hebrew scriptures that are all basically patriarchal in nature. Indigenous people didn't see it that way. They had a matriarchal organization. So it's not so-and-so was the father of so-and-so. It was so-and-so was the mother of so-and-so. And it just so happens that my great-great-great-grandmother was the sister of Itancha Red Cloud, or Chief Red Cloud, of the Oglala Sioux tribe. And I could talk about how that's a big deal, but I also know that just about 50% of the people in my tribe can claim the same thing. So it's not that big of a deal. Now, our elders have taught us that back in those days when females were the heads of households, there was virtually no domestic violence or abuse. Just didn't happen. Today, in colonized indigenous communities, indigenous women suffer the most domestic violence and abuse than any other group of people in proportion to the population. It's a serious, serious problem. That's one of the results of colonization, is the spread of domestic violence and abuse among indigenous people. Traditionally, a husband was not allowed culturally or socially to be abusive to his wife, to his partner. The community wouldn't stand for it. He'd be run out, and there'd be nothing he could do about it. Another thing in the society there, people lived in the present immediate state, in the here and now. We didn't think about the future, or we didn't lament the events of the past. There was no past, there was no future, there was just right here, right now. That was the reality in which indigenous people lived. In some indigenous languages, including my tribe's Lakota language, there is no past tense. There's no past tense. There's basically just present tense and kind of a future tense. So if somebody is going to go fishing, for example, now we shouldn't say fishing, we didn't fish. We were hunters. If someone was going to go hunting, they would just say, I go hunting, or I'm going hunting. Now that could mean that they're going to go hunting right away that day, or it could mean that they're going hunting tomorrow, or it could mean that they're going hunting next week. Just, I'm hunting, or I'm going hunting, is what they would say. And so people they were informed that at some point this person was going to go hunting. And that's all the more specific they needed to be. When the When the missionaries, especially the Roman Catholic and Episcopal missionaries, came into indigenous communities and were teaching about the Holy Eucharist to indigenous people, and they taught about that part that is so hard for those of us from the Western world to wrap our mind around, the anamnesis part of the Eucharist, the sursum corda, the part where we say, lift up your hearts, we lift them to the Lord, where we join together with angels and archangels and all the company of heaven, where time stops and we enter eternity, a timeless state where we're all united together, past, present, and future at the altar of Christ. Indigenous people picked that up very easily. They got that right away because that's the way that they lived. So they had no difficulty understanding that interpretation of the Eucharist, and they embraced it. Direct eye contact is inappropriate for indigenous people. It is seen as rude, even hostile. And not just indigenous cultures, there are some other cultures where that is the case too, some Asian cultures. People don't look at each other directly in the eyes when they talk to each other. They might look away or, even turn their back to you, talk to you like this. And so in the Western world, in the European world, that was seen as disrespectful. And in the boarding schools, when indigenous children would go there to be assimilated, they wouldn't look their teacher in the eye, they wouldn't look the principal in the eye, they'd look away. And so immediately they were distrusted. It was assumed that they had done something wrong and they were hiding something. They were not being honest and transparent, and so they were punished. When in fact all they were doing was following their own cultural practice of not looking someone directly in the eye out of respect. Out of respect. Some anthropologists think that goes all the way back to when indigenous people lived in very small buildings, such as huts and teepees, especially in the wintertime when you had to spend all your time within that small dwelling, that not looking at someone directly was a way of giving them privacy and respecting them in that way, that was really the only way you could do it. To give somebody privacy was to not look at them. It's a theory, anyway. Direct eye contact is really only appropriate for indigenous people in two situations. Where you're extremely angry at somebody and want to fight them, or when you're extremely attracted to someone and want to engage in amorous activity. So you can see how difficult it was for indigenous people to have to learn to do that. It was just so contrary to how they lived. My father never did direct eye contact. I'd be talking to him and his eyes would be darting all over the place, but he hardly ever looked me directly in the eyes. Because the earth is seen as a relative, the ownership of land or exclusive ownership of anything is unthinkable. It would be like owning your relative. How would you like to own your relative? That's weird, isn't it? But today in American society and throughout most of the world, land is seen as something that is owned by somebody because their name is on a deed that's filed away in a courthouse. Indigenous people never, ever saw it that way. You don't do that with an equal. You don't do that with your relative. Family, in particular the extended family, is a priority over individual success or achievement. In my tribe, the Tioshbe is the extended family, the Tioshbe. The Tioshbe consists of anybody that you can trace any kind of direct blood relationship to. So that would involve parents, siblings, aunties and uncles, cousins, and then second cousins, if you can establish any kind of a bloodline too. That is your Tioshbe. So an uncle is usually referred to as the father, as well as your biological father. So you can have 2 or 3 fathers. Same way with an auntie. An auntie is seen as your mother. And your siblings, your cousins are seen as your siblings. So brothers and sisters are your cousins. That type of a deep, extensive family network was the Tioshbe. And then anybody else in the tribe that you have no direct blood relationship with, that's your cousin. That's your cousin. So it became normative for indigenous people to marry outside of their tribes, because you can't marry someone who you have a direct relationship with, a blood relationship with. So indigenous men and women typically looked for those outside of their tribal network as marriage partners. So that was a center, as I was saying earlier, of the culture and the language and the stories and the narratives that were taught were done within the Tioshbe, or the extended family. Now, what Indian child removal processes did, such as the boarding schools, is it shredded the Tioshbe, got rid of it, completely severed those ties, to the extent where many of these indigenous children had no family at all. And that was the objective, because they didn't want that tie to the source of the culture and the source of the language and the source of the spirituality. And so my mother and my father really didn't know their siblings very well, and hardly knew their parents. And that extended throughout the generations, where I never knew my grandparents, hardly knew my aunties and uncles or cousins. I couldn't tell you the names of most of my cousins. Whereas in traditional society with a Tioshbe, you'd be knowing these people and loving them and interacting with them all the time. So family was the most important thing, and it still is. I mean, I think most of us as indigenous people, we're trying to find who our relatives are, trying to put it back together again. It's not easy to do that when there's been this chasm of separation that's gone on for several generations. But we still value family above everything else, which is why we will always make a sacrifice for our family. And the result of that is that most of us, when it comes to jobs and careers and making a success of yourself in the world, most of us don't get very far. We don't. Because what happens when you decide to put yourself first? What happens when you decide to put your career first? And move to wherever you can find a job, and then move again to wherever you can find a better job, and spend all your time working 50, 60 hours a week, and getting ahead, working up the corporate ladder. You know, what gets sacrificed when you do that? Your family. Indigenous people are not willing to do that. It's against our culture, so we don't excel, at least in the eyes of the world. And then elders are given the utmost respect and preferential treatment in all things. I had to defer to an elder getting in line for lunch. This person said, "No, you go first." And I said, "No, you have to go first. You're my elder." If you live to a certain age, there's got to be something in it for you, I guess. I don't know, but we still believe that. Now, there is a difference between being elderly and an elder. If a person is elderly, a senior citizen, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that they have the role of elder. They're respected, but elder is its own role within the community that a person is given and functions within. So they're seen as a source of wisdom and advice that people can come to. So just because you're elderly chronologically does not mean that you're in the role of an elder, but you're still given respect. So if you go into an Indigenous community and you want to meet with an elder, as I have done, typically the way you do it is you don't approach the elder directly. Don't approach the elder directly. You go to the elder's family, either son or daughter or grandson or granddaughter, and ask if you can meet with the elder. And then that person will tell you yes or no, and will tell you when and how to do it. And if you're granted permission to do it, then you go to the elder's house at the appointed time, and then you're invited in, and you usually bring something with you, a gift of some kind, or food, or tobacco, a gift for the elder. And then you sit in the elder's living room, and then the elder comes in, and then you say nothing. You just sit and wait for the elder to start talking. And the elder will eventually start talking about whatever the elder feels the need to talk about. And then that is the wisdom that is being imparted to you. And then you say, thank you very much, and you give your gift, and then you go on your way. You don't interview an elder. And you never tell an elder to shut up. That's profoundly disrespectful. Sometimes the elders, when they start talking, they can go on for a long time. And you don't have to sit and listen to them intently and hang on to their every word. I mean, you can stretch or get up and walk around or go to the bathroom if you have to and come back. You just don't tell them to shut up. That's what it is. That's totally countercultural. Indigenous cultures do not recognize binary gender classifications. We don't. This male, female, and that's it. No, we've never recognized that. There are either at least 3 genders or no word for gender at all in Indigenous communities. Gender is a social construct, and it varies within cultures and across cultures. The binary gender identification was inflicted upon Indigenous people as a part of colonization, and still is today. In my tribe, there was a third, what you would call gender, although we didn't have a word for gender, but the third one would have been the Winkte. And the Winkte was a male who chose to live as a female. And the Winkte were accepted. They weren't persecuted or seen as crazy. They were embraced by the community and seen as having special powers. And they were referred to as two-spirited. And they would give people a different perspective on life. And so people would commonly come to Winkte people for advice and if they were having a difficult time with something. And the Winkte were seen as especially compassionate and empathetic to people who were in crisis or distress of some kind. So when you think about these gender roles or, gender classifications, think about the effect that colonization had on that. If you were an Indigenous woman living in a traditional Indigenous community where you were in charge of the household and the village, all of a sudden you're told now that you do not have that role, that's the role that men have. Men are in charge. You have no rights. A man can do whatever he wants to with you. Think of how devastating that must have been to Indigenous women. Think of how devastating it must have been to Indigenous people who did not fit a binary gender classification. That all of a sudden you have to be either male or female, whether you feel like it or not, whether you see yourself as that or not. So that was the pre-Columbian world, and now the post-Columbian world came in to play through the process of colonization. And it started with the doctrine of discovery. Well, actually, the colonization of the Western world, the Western Hemisphere started with the doctrine of discovery. Colonization has been around for a long time, much longer than that, all over the world. But we're focusing on the Western Hemisphere now. I'm always amazed at how many people don't know or have never heard of the doctrine of discovery. Most people have never heard of the doctrine of discovery in the church and in the general population of American society. Never heard of it. And a good number of those who have heard of it don't know what it is. They couldn't explain to you what it's about. And so we're going to focus on that right now. There is no one document called the Doctrine of Discovery, just like there's a document called the Declaration of Independence or the Constitution or the Bill of Rights or something like that, the Magna Carta. The Doctrine of Discovery is a series of papal decrees or bulls calling for the colonization of Africa and the Western Hemisphere, the taking of land, and the subjugation and religious indoctrination of the indigenous people in those regions. That's the Doctrine of Discovery, a series of papal decrees, edicts coming out of the office of the Pope. And over to the right there is an example of what it looked like. And the seal that's hanging from that document, that decree, is a seal of the office of the Pope. And the Latin term for that was bulla. That's a bulla hanging there on the document. And that's why we call it papal bull or papal bulls. The result of these papal bulls was genocide. Intentionally and systematically implemented on the indigenous people of the Western Hemisphere from 1492 to 1890. I use that year 1890 because that's the year of the Wounded Knee Massacre in South Dakota, December 29th, 1890, in which at least 300 Lakota, Dakota, Nakota, men, women, children, and elders were brutally murdered by the United States Army 7th Cavalry and buried in a mass grave, which is still there at the Wounded Knee site. But indigenous people will tell you that the genocide is still happening. It's still happening, and there are a number of different ways of understanding what genocide is and how it's enacted, but it's still happening. It didn't stop at Wounded Knee. A quote from Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz in her book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, is the second paragraph. And if you have not read that book, An Indigenous People's History of the United States, I strongly encourage you to do so. It will give you the indigenous view of history, and from the lens of an indigenous person and a professor, a professional historian. Roxanne says nearly all the population areas of the Americas were reduced by 90% following the onset of colonizing projects, decreasing the targeted indigenous populations of the Americas from 100 million to 10 million, commonly referred to as the most extreme demographic disaster, framed as natural, in human history. The worst genocide that we know of in the history of humankind took place right here in our own backyard. It was initiated by European invaders in North America and continued by United States government and churches, us, through assimilation processes, namely boarding schools. And as I said, there are numerous genocidal tactics or ways of making a people disappear, and we'll get to that in a few minutes. And that's my understanding of genocide, is making a people disappear so they're no longer around. You don't see them, they have no influence or presence. Nobody talks about them except as relics of the past. So in these papal decrees, the Pope asserts the rights to colonize, convert, and enslave. The first papal decree that's part of the Doctrine of Discovery is the Dum Diversas. The Dum Diversas was issued in 1452 and then followed a couple years later by the Romanus Pontifex. So those are two documents. Bulls issued by Pope Nicholas V to King Afonso V of Portugal, confirming to the crown of Portugal dominion over the lands in Africa, along with encouraging the seizure of the lands of Saracen Turks and non-Christians. They granted permission for the enslavement of such peoples. So the Doctrine of Discovery actually, the first target of the Doctrine of Discovery was the continent of Africa and Portugal as the colonizing nation. The foundation for African slavery came from these two documents, the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex. The foundation for African slavery came out of the church. Here's a quote from the Dum Diversas and another example of what a papal bull looks like. This is the Pope's office here. It says, "We grant you by these present documents." So the Pope grants the King of Portugal by these present documents with our apostolic authority, full and free permission to invade, search out, capture, and subjugate the Saracens and pagans and any other unbelievers and enemies of Christ, wherever they may be, as well as their kingdoms, duchies, counties, principalities, and other property, and to reduce their persons into perpetual servitude. That's the office of the Pope talking there. What I find intriguing about this is that they believe that the same kind of social and governmental structures that existed in Europe at that time also existed in the Americas, also existed in the Western Hemisphere. And we know that that is not the case, just by our previous look at the pre-Columbian world and indigenous worldviews. But they assumed that it was the same in the Americas or in the Western Hemisphere as it was in Europe. So then there was a third papal decree, the Inter Cetera, that was issued in 1493, 1 year after the first Columbian voyage. A different pope, Pope Alexander VI, authorized Spain and Portugal, to colonize the Americas and its native peoples as discovered subjects. And so Spain gets involved, as well as Portugal. The Americas, or the Western Hemisphere, is targeted now. And the idea of discovering land and discovering subjects is introduced for the first time in the document, the papal decree, the Inter Cetera. And then the decree also asserted the rights of Spain and Portugal to colonize, convert, and enslave discovered Africans as well. So just kind of reinforcing the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex. So now we have Portugal and Spain involved. And then a year later, the Treaty of Tordesillas, went into effect, in which the Pope endorsed Spain and Portugal's extension of their states into the newly discovered Western Hemisphere. So that was the Treaty of Tordesillas. This treaty divided the Western Hemisphere, as it was known to be at the time, between Spain and Portugal, from what is currently Greenland down to Brazil. So Greenland down to Brazil was divvied up between Spain and Portugal in the Treaty of Tordesillas. They just said it was theirs to take. And the Pope granted, by his authority, endorsed it. That's a lot of land. That's a lot of territory for just two European nations to decide that they had ownership over. Now, this sounds outrageous, right? This sounds ridiculous. You know, who would take something like this seriously, right? Who's going to pay attention to this? Or this is an old treaty that people have forgotten about, right? Well, The Treaty of Tordesillas was actually invoked in a point of international law in 1982 during the Falkland Islands War between Great Britain and Argentina, in which Argentina was trying to assert that by virtue of the Treaty of Tordesillas, as a colony of Spain, Argentina had rights to the Falkland Islands. It didn't work. But they tried it because they saw this treaty as still having validity. So these are not just old documents that everybody has forgotten about. Now, we may never have heard of them, but their impact is still very much in effect. It hasn't diminished at all. So it began with Portugal, then it went to Spain, and then it went to England, this discovery philosophy. King Henry VII granted a patent to John Cabot and his sons in 1496. And what Henry VII did was he indicated his official royal support for John Cabot's enterprise. As an agent of the English crown, Cabot was empowered to investigate, claim, and possess lands, quote, which before this time were unknown to all Christians. That's a direct quote from the Dum Diversus that King Henry is using in his patent here. Which meant that Cabot could not intrude on Spanish and Portuguese discoveries because they were already Christian nations that had claimed those territories of their own. And then King Henry VII would receive 1/5 of the value of merchandise brought from the New World back to Bristol, though he had invested no money of his own. So now, not only has this discovery philosophy spread from Portugal to Spain to England, but now it's all about an enterprise. It's about colonization for the purposes of wealth and power. It's about wealth and power now. It's not about the gospel. It's not about going forth and making disciples. It's about wealth and power and dominance. And it's in England now. And then it was promulgated by European monarchies and other countries that were involved in the colonization process, such as France and the Netherlands, in order to legitimize colonization of lands outside of Europe. So the philosophy allowed European entities to seize lands inhabited by indigenous peoples with the justification of discovery, beginning in 1606. And along with that was the philosophy or the concept of terra nullius, that there's nothing here until it's discovered by a European nation. Only then does it exist. And at that point, it's owned by the European nation. Oh, and 1606, what happened in 1607? Jamestown, the Jamestown colony, was founded in what is now Virginia. Not the first, but the longest continually operating colony of England. So then, with the British colonies in what is now known as the United States, and then after the Revolutionary War, and the United States was in the early stages of its existence as a country, in 1792, the U.S. Secretary of State Thomas Jefferson declared that the discovery philosophy would extend from Europe to the infant U.S. government. The doctrine and its legacy began to influence American imperialism and the treatment of indigenous peoples. So now it's in the United States. Jefferson was a big fan of the discovery philosophy. He thought it was a good thing. And he wrote the Declaration of Independence in 1776, and in that document, if you remember reading it, Jefferson referred to the indigenous people of the New World as merciless Indian savages, who would be specifically excluded from the principles of freedom and human rights declared in the document. So this idea of certain rights and certain truths to be self-evident, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, etc., did not apply to indigenous people, according to Thomas Jefferson. And where is Jefferson now? Well, he's on Mount Rushmore. His image is carved there along with Washington and Teddy Roosevelt and Abraham Lincoln. He's on the nickel. He's on the $2 bill, for whatever that's worth. He's on our currency. There's a beautiful monument dedicated to him in Washington, D.C. He's seen as one of our greatest presidents, as one of our founders. He's one of our national heroes. But that's what he thought of indigenous people. Then it comes to the Supreme Court. In the 19th century U.S., the doctrine of discovery was specifically used conceptually in the debate of public international law expounded by the U.S. Supreme Court in a series of decisions, most notably Johnson versus McIntosh in 1823. You probably remember that from history class if you were awake. And Johnson versus McIntosh said a lot of things. It was very extensive. But basically, in a nutshell, one of the things it said was that indigenous tribes have no right to their land. They have no right to their land. They don't have to be there. They have no right to be there on that land. They can be driven out. And the Supreme Court gave the go-ahead for that in Johnson versus McIntosh. And how did Chief Justice John Marshall come to that conclusion? Well, he said that the right of discovery was well illustrated by the royal commission that England's King Henry VII gave to John Cabot and his sons. That commission instructed the Cabots to seek out, discover, and find whatsoever isles, countries, and provinces of the heathens and infidels that before this time had been unknown to all Christian people. Again, almost verbatim direct quote from the Dum Diversas and the Romanus Pontifex. It's in the Supreme Court now. And the Supreme Court called this claim a right of domination. So the U.S. at that point, the U.S. government had a right of domination over all indigenous tribes, as far as the U.S. wanted to expand. But an interesting thing happened after that, almost 10 years later. Marshall apparently changed his mind on the issue of indigenous tribal rights in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, which was initiated by attorneys representing indigenous tribes in the southeastern part of the United States. Marshall ruled in favor of several southeastern U.S. native tribes that the U.S. must establish relations with them as sovereign nations. So he flip-flopped, and I'm not sure. I need to find out why. I don't know why he did that. I mean, I'm glad he did. I don't know what his reasoning was or how he changed his mind. But President Andrew Jackson refused to support or enforce this decision. The president at that time, 1832, refused to support it. In fact, he defied it even though it was a Supreme Court ruling. The quote that's attributed to Jackson is that the Chief Justice made his decision, now let him enforce it. A complete disregard for the separation of powers provided for by the Constitution, and a violation of the Constitution in doing that. So a president who does something like that, you'd think they'd be at least impeached, right? Well, what happened to Andrew Jackson? Well, he's seen as one of our greatest presidents. Many people honor him. He has lots of statues. He's on the $20 bill. Every time you open your wallet or purse and bring out a $20 bill, there he is. So because of Jackson's refusal to follow this Supreme Court ruling, the trail of tears ensued. Which is why you have virtually no active indigenous communities within a certain number of the southeastern states today, when there was once a flourishing number of indigenous tribes there prior to 1832. forcibly deported to Oklahoma on the Trail of Tears. The thing that's most heartbreakingly ironic about the Trail of Tears, Bishop Stephen Charleston writes about it in his book, The Four Vision Quests of Jesus, if you've read that book. We might be running out. If you haven't read Four Vision Quests of Jesus, I strongly encourage you to do that, by Stephen Charleston. He's an Episcopal bishop, an indigenous person. He's a member of the Choctaw Nation. In that book, he writes in detail the fact that many of these indigenous people who were forced to march from their homeland to Oklahoma, a good number of them dying along the way, were Christians. They had already become Christian. They were members of Christian denominations. So it wasn't just white people doing this to indigenous people. This was Christians doing it to Christians. The Trail of Tears. Which will lead me to another thing that I would like to expand on later on, and that is that when Christianity came over to this country through the doctrine of discovery, it also came with the narrative of white supremacy. Christianity came to this country along with the narrative of white supremacy. And those two narratives have not yet been effectively separated from each other. Which is why this happened. You know, this makes perfect sense if you're a white supremacist. And there are white supremacists in this day and age who see themselves as good Christians, and they don't have a conflict with that. It's because that's their narrative. I'll take questions just before we break. How about that? Whenever we're going to break. I guess whenever I see people dancing, I'll know we'll need to break. It's 1:31 right now. We'll keep going. Manifest destiny. How many of you have heard of that? Yes. That was a phrase attributed to a New York newspaper editor. It expressed the philosophy that drove 19th century U.S. territorial expansion. Manifest destiny held that the United States was destined by God to expand its dominion and spread democracy and capitalism across the entire North American continent. God-given manifest destiny. Just open your eyes and see what's happening. And this is a painting done by an American artist named John Gast. It's called American Progress. Dated to 1870, I think, or 1872, sometime around there. And this is a part of a genre that was very popular at that time, manifest destiny art, depicting the various images of it. And this is one example of it. What do you see in that painting, if you're able to see it? I know that it's too bright in some areas and too dark in other areas, but what sticks out to you? Yes. In the lower left-hand corner or over to the left, indigenous people are fleeing to the west. Anything else? Oh, yes, yes. You have what you have is in the west. It's an east to west. And what do you see in the east? You see bright lights. Enlightenment, perhaps. You see stagecoaches, trains, covered wagons, ships on a river in the distance, farmers and prospectors all moving west, and leading them is a figure Anybody want to guess the name of that figure? Destiny? Well, that kind of goes along with the theme of the painting, doesn't it? Liberty. Yep, Liberty. Liberty or Columbia. Columbia or Liberty, Lady Liberty, the personification of America. Beautiful, somewhat scantily clad, blonde-haired woman carrying a spool of telegraph wire. She's holding a book, some type of authoritative-looking book. Maybe it's the Bible. And she's leading all of this from east to west. And in the west, being driven out in the dark, stormy clouds into the mountains, the Rocky Mountains, are the indigenous people. And if you can see them a little farther up, bison or buffalo being driven out. That's American progress, and it was seen as a good thing by people. People thought this was wonderful. People thought this was God's will. The leadership in the churches thought this was God's will. They were all on board with it, including our own denomination, the Episcopal Church. So colonization destroyed the pre-Columbian worldview. That pre-Columbian worldview that I was talking about before lunch and just afterwards. Colonization wiped it out. With genocide, land theft, forced cultural assimilation, prohibition of indigenous languages, religious indoctrination, depiction of indigenous people as obsolete, depiction of the perpetrators as good guys. And I want to talk about that for a minute or two. In this particular genocide, we don't really like to talk about it in the United States, do we? We like to pretend that it didn't happen, we minimize it, or we say ridiculous things like slavery was good for the slaves. It taught them a trade, it taught them how to survive. You know, we don't want to admit that our leadership was responsible for this horrible genocide. And part of the reason we don't want to admit it is because the descendants of the perpetrators in our government is still in power. This isn't like the Nazis in World War II, where they were recognized as an evil empire and they were wiped out, and justifiably so, because of what they did. Well, what happened here was at least 10 times as awful as what happened in Nazi Germany, and for a much longer period of time. And the perpetrating government is still in power and is seen as the good guys. You know, Jefferson, Jackson, those are our heroes. They're the good guys. They're good people. They weren't perpetrators of genocide, but they were. Think of the psychological impact that has on indigenous people. That those who are responsible for the murders of their ancestors and the enforced assimilation culturally, the theft of land, attempts to make them disappear, are seen as the good guys. Their pictures are on the wall. There are monuments and statues dedicated to them. Even in the boarding schools that happened. My parents told me that portraits of the presidents, including Jackson and Jefferson, were hanging on the walls of the classrooms in the boarding schools. You think of what that says to an indigenous person. It says that you're not supposed to be here. And if you are here, you're supposed to be something other than who you are. Something other than who your ancestors were. It's no wonder that among indigenous people and young people in particular, they have the highest suicide rates in the United States, in proportion to the population, of course, but the highest rates of suicide as far as categories of people. You know, when a person growing up gets the clear message that they're not supposed to be around anymore, they'll make it happen. And it's sad. I mean, I talk to a number of clergy, indigenous and non-indigenous, who are serving on reservations and in indigenous areas, who will just say, you know, that they've had so many funerals that all they do are funerals. They don't have time for teaching. They don't have time for any other kind of programmatic activities because they have to do so many funerals all the time, and for young people, many of whom have taken their own lives. It's heartbreaking. Well, one person I know on the Standing Rock said that whenever this happens again, we're so used to it, we don't even cry anymore. We're so used to it that we don't even cry anymore. So that's the effect of colonization. We covered this a little bit before with Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz's quote about how extensive the genocide was. We don't know how many indigenous people were living in the Western Hemisphere before 1492. Of course, there was no census or anything like that was enacted. Anthropologists estimate that before 1492, the indigenous population in what is now known as the United States may have been at least 10 million. Some suggest 50 million or more. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz says 100 million. We don't know for sure. But what we do know is that in 1890, when there was a census, the U.S. indigenous population was recorded at 249,000. Now, that doesn't include a few states that weren't states at that time, Wyoming, Alaska, and Hawaii, maybe Nevada, I'm not sure, but still, let's just say it was that bare minimum of 10 million before 1492. By 1890, that figure should have at least doubled under ordinary circumstances. If 400 years we're talking about, should have at least doubled to 20 million or more. But instead, the population was nearly exterminated. 249,000. So that's what genocide looks like statistically. The population of Europe tripled, by the way, between 1492 and 1890. So genocide, how do you make a people disappear? Well, one way was just to kill them. And that happened. This is Lakota artist Oscar Howe's painting of Wounded Knee, December 29th, 1890, in which over 300 Lakota, Dakota, Nakota men, women, children, and elders were slaughtered by the United States Army, the 7th Cavalry, at Wounded Knee, South Dakota, and are buried in a mass grave there. The officers responsible for that were given medals of honor. There has been some movement to try to rescind those, but I don't think it's actually happened. I think those medals have not yet been rescinded. So that's one example of genocide, but there was a problem with doing this. Anybody want to guess what the problem was? I mean, besides that it's wrong to kill people. Think dollars and cents. It was too expensive. It cost too much money to send an army out there and clothe and feed them, pay them, to track down tribes and kill them, knowing that some of them were going to be killed in the process as well. So they found a cheaper alternative. It was determined that it was cheaper, it cost less money to remove an indigenous child from their cultural family context and put them in a boarding school and raise them there where they were assimilated into the American society, so the indigenous part of them would disappear. So it was a cheaper form of genocide, and that's where the boarding schools were introduced around the 1870s. And the federal government was involved in them, the Department of the Army was involved with them, and churches were involved with them. The process of Indian child removal goes way farther back than that, however. There were instances in which indigenous children were either taken out of their indigenous family context or somehow through hardship or loss of parents and relatives ended up in the homes of white families. Many of them were clergy. And they would raise the indigenous children within their family context. And they were Christianized that way and learned English and essentially became non-indigenous culturally. That was going on for a number of decades, from the early 1800s up until the boarding school era. And there was one indigenous person who went through an assimilation process similar to that, was assimilated through a family, a non-indigenous family in New York, David Pendleton Okerhader, who is one of our saints on the Episcopal calendar in lesser feasts and fasts or new commemorations or holy men, holy women, or whatever they're calling it now. September 1st is his day. David Pendleton Okerhader. He was a Cheyenne. His Indian name was Making Medicine. He was a Cheyenne warrior and was in battle with the United States Army in Oklahoma. He was captured and taken to a POW camp in Florida, Fort Marion, which was located at the Castillo de San Marcos in St. Augustine. Some of you may have been there before and seen it. And he was imprisoned there for a number of years before he came under the care of a U.S. Army lieutenant at the time named Richard Henry Pratt. And Pratt had already started the practice of sending indigenous people to live with non-indigenous families so that they could be assimilated in that way. And so Richard Henry Pratt and David Pendleton Okerhader became acquainted, and Okerhader decided to go to New York, where he lived with a prominent, wealthy family there. He learned how to speak English and was assimilated into American culture and society. And then he could have become anything he wanted to be in New York, but he decided that he wanted to return home to Oklahoma to be with his people. And so he did that, and he served in the church and was ordained a deacon. And he was the first indigenous person to be on the calendar of saints in the Episcopal Church, David Pendleton Okerhader. So that's how child removal and assimilation happened. Boarding schools were a way of making it happen in wholesale fashion across the board with large numbers of indigenous children, and more cheap than killing them. This is a photo of the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. That was the flagship federal government-operated indigenous boarding school. And indigenous children from all over the United States and areas that weren't the United States at that time, such as Alaska, were sent. They were removed from their families, removed from their tioshbe, and sent to Carlisle to live and become assimilated. So that's the student body. That photo was taken in the 1870s, shortly after Carlisle was opened. And at that time, the superintendent of Carlisle was an Army officer who had been a lieutenant, and at that time had become a captain, Henry Richard Pratt, the same guy who took David Pendleton Okerhader under his wing. He became the superintendent of Carlisle. He was head of operations there. And he's the one who established the motto of the Carlisle School. Carlisle actually had two mottos. One that was more publicly known and one that was more privately known. And the one that was more publicly known that they publicized was, "The Lord helps those who help themselves," was the motto. The Lord helps those who help themselves, which is not a quote from Scripture or anything like that. The private one that wasn't really discussed was, "Kill the Indian, save the man." Kill the Indian, save the man. So if you want indigenous people to survive in the New World, you have to take whatever's Indian out of them, kill it, in order that they may have a chance of surviving and being a success in the New World. Kind of similar to, give a slave a trade so he or she could survive in the New World. The same type. So I took these where's this? Okay, I took these pictures of the Indian cemetery at Carlisle several years ago. There's a Commonwealth of Pennsylvania historical landmark. The school itself closed in 1918. It opened in 1879, closed in 1918. Over 10,000 indigenous children attended the school during that time. It's now an Army War College and actually has been since the school closed. And you have to go through a military checkpoint in order to get in there, which I did, in order to see the cemetery, the Indian cemetery, which is really all that's left of the boarding school era of the time. So in this cemetery are the graves, at that time, of 186 indigenous children who died at Carlisle and were buried there. In other words, they weren't allowed to go home, or they weren't sent home for burial. They sent there to be assimilated, and they died there, and they were buried there. And so that's what the cemetery looks like. Because it's under the auspices of the U.S. Army, it does look like a typical military cemetery. And those are the tombstones. Tombstones have the names of the students and the tribal affiliations of them. I don't know if you can see it, but there's one that's Apache that's there. There's one that's Oneida that's there. It's kind of hard to see with the light. It's a little too bright. But some of the tombstones are just marked unknown. Because even as meticulous and thorough as Carlisle was at keeping records, some of the students there, they just don't know who they were after they were sent there. Carlisle, as with all boarding school experiences, was devastating. Here's a photo contrast of 3 Lakota boys before they entered Carlisle on the left, and then after they had been there for some time on the right. You can see they've gotten older and a little bigger. But look at that contrast, before and after. That's a visual representation of assimilation. The photo on the left shows the three boys in their traditional dress, their traditional attire. There's some regalia along with it. That was what they wore. Essentially told a story about themselves, who they were, where they came from, rites of passage that they had gone through. You do certain things, you achieve certain things, and you have the right to wear something like a badge of honor. In Lakota tradition, the black-tipped eagle feathers worn by 2 of them in there, that meant that they had become adults. They had become adults and were ready to start their own families. But they were taken to Carlisle, where all of that was taken from them. stripped away from them. The young men had to become boys again and learn all over from scratch. Their hair was cut and they were given uniforms to look like everyone else. I don't know how anybody could have survived that experience, and some of them didn't, but how horrific. The only thing I can think of to compare it to is a concentration camp. It would be that bad. But it was seen as a good thing. And our government was heavily invested in it, and our churches were heavily invested in it too. Now, as I said, both of my parents went to boarding school. At the top there is a photo of what used to be St. Mary's Episcopal School for Indian Girls. That's the administration building. All the buildings no longer exist. They were torn down many decades ago. But that's what that looked like. And then on the bottom is a picture of my father before he went to the boarding school. He's right there on the left. And he's with his two brothers. That's one of the rare times that they had to spend with each other. These two, that's my Uncle Billy, I think, and that's my Uncle Richard. They were older. They had already gone to boarding school, and so this must have been that they were able to come home on a break. And that's my dad there, Sylvan, very young. And in the back there, that's their house where they lived. His parents lived there. And then that's my dad at age 17, after he'd been at the boarding school for about 12 years in Pine Ridge, the Oglala Community School. My dad, like a lot of young, or like a lot of our elders to this day, when they think about their boarding school experience and talk about them, some of them won't even talk about them. They don't want to, but those who do will kind of whitewash it. They'll try to accentuate the positive. And they'll say that, well, it was a good experience. It gave us an education. It gave us a trade. We learned things to help us survive. And we wouldn't have been able to come along as far as we did in life if we hadn't had that. But they don't talk about they don't talk about the reason that they were in that situation to begin with. That they were in a situation of desperation that was inflicted upon them. So they would need something as horrible as the boarding schools to survive. And here's the senior class photo, the class of 1949 of the Oglala Community High School. And there's my dad right there toward the center. Just look at them there. They're all fresh pressed and beautiful, handsome, slicked back in suits and dresses, and they look like they're ready to go out and take on the world, don't they? They look like they're ready to make a success of themselves. And that was the objective of the boarding school, was to have them look like that when it was over. But the reality is virtually none of them went forward and became a success. So many of them succumbed to alcohol and drug addictions and accidental deaths. And when my father died, he was one of the last surviving members of that class. It was an objective that never could have been successful. And why should it have been? And how could it have been? And it never should have been implemented to begin with. Well, the good news is that the Episcopal Church repudiated the Doctrine of Discovery in 2009, and there have been several General Convention resolutions since then that have followed through with the repudiation, and most Christian denominations have done so since then. Early this year, the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, finally did. I think they were the last of the major Christian denominations to repudiate the Doctrine of Discovery. It will be interesting to see what they do next as a response to that. Because when you understand what the doctrine of discovery is, and you understand the devastating effect that it had on indigenous people to this day, you can't, in good conscience, as a Christian, say, well, that was a bad chapter in history, and let's just forget about it and move on. You can't do that. That's not what Jesus would do. You have to respond to the aftermath of what happened and find a way. So that's one of the things that my office is doing, and that's why I'm here with you today, is to teach the church about the doctrine of discovery and its impact, and to talk about, the possibility of what the next steps might be as we move forward as a church. One frustrating thing, however, that I will let you know is that in this day and age, alternative views of history in America, views of history that are not based in the Columbus discovery manifest destiny narrative, are viewed suspiciously by a number of people. There are people in this country who love their Columbus discovery manifest destiny narrative of America, and they don't want it changed. They don't want it messed with. And they see any other teaching, any other view of history as being un-American propaganda and radical extremism. So there's going to be that to contend with. And it's not that that's anything new, but it's still very much around. So many of you might already know about this or have heard about it. At the time in 2021, a statement was issued by Presiding Bishop Michael Curry and at that time House of Deputies President Gay Jennings with regard to the indigenous boarding schools that the Episcopal Church operated. And this came as a result of the discovery of unmarked graves on the properties of boarding schools, indigenous boarding schools in Canada, where the number is way up now. I think it's in the thousands now. It seems like it keeps growing all the time, of unmarked graves that they've discovered in indigenous boarding schools in Canada. When that happened, there was a shock all over the country. And there was an initial tendency to say, well, shame on Canada for doing that. Shame on the government and the churches of Canada for doing that. But those of us who knew about the boarding schools here in the United States, whose parents and grandparents attended them, knew that our government was involved in that as well, and that our churches, including the Episcopal Church, was involved in it. We came forward to Executive Council and said, we can't point the finger at Canada. We got to look at what we did and take responsibility for it. So for the first time, when we go to the break, I'll have to get a new battery. 2021, the Episcopal Church for the first time publicly acknowledged that we operated Indian boarding schools, and we acknowledged the devastating impact that it had on indigenous people and communities for the first time in 2021. Now, most of our boarding schools closed by the 1920s. And the reason that they did was because the federal government cut off funding to religious indigenous boarding schools at that time. So we used to get a lot of government assistance to operate our Episcopal boarding schools, and then it was cut off by 1920. So our indigenous boarding schools had to raise funds and had to scramble to find means of continuing to operate, and most of them couldn't. And so they closed before 1921. So it only took 100 years for us to acknowledge that we did this. But we'll go with that. We'll go with that. It's a good thing that it was done. They said, while complete records are unavailable, we know that the Episcopal Church was associated with indigenous schools during the 19th and 20th centuries. We must come to a full understanding of the legacies of these schools. To that end, we commit to the work of truth and reconciliation with indigenous communities in our church. We pledge to spend time with our indigenous siblings, listening to their stories and history, and seeking their wisdom about how we can together come to terms with this part of our history. Beautiful words. I mean, I cried when I first saw those. Yeah, it was a long time coming. It would have been nice to have a statement like this come out in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. But we'll take it as it is right now. So what has been the follow-up? Well, Executive Council last year passed a resolution to support a commission to begin the work of investigating our history of operating Episcopal Indigenous boarding schools. And it's called the Executive Council Commission on Indigenous Boarding Schools and Advocacy, is what it's called. And the one commission has already been appointed to look into carrying out the missives of that resolution, a lot of which is going to involve just doing basic research on our schools. There's so much we don't know. We don't even know how many schools they were or where they were all located. There's no main repository of records. The records, such as they are scattered all over the place. And that's going to be a long, painstaking process of doing that research. And then there's an advocacy piece to that. You know, what do we do as a result of the information that we learn? So there's an Executive Council Commission, and then at General Convention last year, General Convention passed a resolution, A-127, on the Indigenous boarding schools, which pledged that we would do our part in gathering information and writing a story and initiating advocacy for Indigenous people and communities as a way of responding to our participation in the assimilation process. So there's two commissions, an Executive Council Commission and a General Convention Commission. I'm on both of them as the liaison to the DFMS staff, but there's a different composition for each commission. Most of them, almost all of them, are Indigenous people. Some of them are elders, some of them are boarding school survivors themselves. We just had our first teams meeting for both commissions, and we're going to have an in-person meeting in a couple of months to talk about how we're going to do our work together as we move forward. Executive Council appropriated $2 million for this work over the next 4 years until 2027. But we are told that that is not the end date, that we don't have to have anything finally decided or determined or close it off and not care about it anymore after 2027, that it will be ongoing. And I'm very pleased with that because I think, as I said, it took us 100 years to get to this point. And I'm not even sure there's anything that can be fixed or solved. But what we can do is not going to happen within 4 years. So it's open-ended work. It's a process that we're just beginning. Anybody dancing yet? You need a break? 2:08. You want to go another 22 minutes and then take a break? Who can wait 22 minutes? One person. Okay. Wow, I salute you. What, do you want to do anything in particular, or it's 2:08, right?
Okay, what all y'all want to do?
You want to take a break or keep going for another 20 minutes?
Want to take a quick break? Yeah.
Okay, they want to take a quick break. 10 minutes? 10 minutes. Okay, welcome back. Picking up where we left off. And by the way, I feel for all of you having to sit in these pews for this length of time. No, I may be standing, but my heart is right there with you. So I mentioned that there were 2 resolutions and 2 commissions, General Convention Resolution A-127 and Executive Council Resolution MW-062 that's coming from the Mission Within committee, the MW, if you're familiar with Executive Council. And so these commissions are charged with investigating the Episcopal Church's legacy, hearing the stories, understanding the impact, discovering the next steps, and looking toward healing and reconciliation. I say looking toward because we are not there yet. As much as we want to be, we have to admit, and it's important to admit, that we are not anywhere near there yet. And we don't want to try to rush into it. As I said, it took 100 years for us to just admit that we committed this wrong. We can't expect forgiveness and reconciliation to happen within a quick time frame. And we want to know what to do. I mean, when so many people hear this history for the first time, especially as it pertains to the Episcopal Church, their initial reaction is, well, what can I do? I want to do something, but I don't know what. And there were a couple of people during break who approached me and asked me that question, and it's a good question. And thank you for having that question or thinking about it, because as I said before, once you understand the doctrine of discovery and its impact on Indigenous people to the present day and the role the Church played in it, it behooves us to do something more than just feel badly about it. And I could talk at length about some possibilities or options. One is helping with repatriation processes, and another one is land acknowledgments, and I'll get into those later. But I think the first thing to be aware of is Indigenous people have been so harmed by church people over the centuries that we have to be very careful about trying to, quote-unquote, help. There is a historically based mistrust of white people and of government workers and church people that you find in Indigenous communities, and that ought to be completely understandable. That's normal. So when Indigenous people or communities are approached by a white person, a non-Indigenous person, especially from the outside, their tendency is to shut their ears and look away. Because if anything, they feel afraid. Okay, what's going to happen now? Is this person going to take advantage of me? Is it going to happen to us again? Is this person going to do something just to make their guilt go away, thinking that they're helping me when they really can't? And I don't want to be so pessimistic as to say that you can't help. But I will say that there are many different ways of doing it that perhaps you haven't thought of. For example, from time to time I'm approached by people who hear about Navajo land and the Navajo Nation and the difficulties that people have living there with the scarcity of water and medical supplies, and et cetera. And they want to go down there and help. And I can't think of any way that could actually happen that would have some tangible, helpful results. If anything, if you went down there, you would probably end up being a burden to the people there. You probably end up having to be taken care of by them. That's a pretty difficult environment to live in, as are most reservations. Most reservations are very, very difficult and dangerous places to be. But there are other ways of doing it. Instead of going someplace else, focus on the indigenous people and the issues that are close to home. There are indigenous people living everywhere. According to the most recent census, over 6 million indigenous people, or people who identify as indigenous, live in the United States, and they're found in every state. Most states have reservations or indigenous communities in urban areas. So there are indigenous people within a very short distance of where you are. And you potentially could be a lot more helpful in reaching out and trying to establish an association and a relationship with those communities than an Alaskan village, for example, or a community on the Navajo Reservation or the Pine Ridge Reservation. Look at what's happening here in your own backyard. Teach your friends and family members about what you're learning today. Make this message known to non-indigenous people that you encounter every day, because there are a lot of people who don't know it. And there are a lot of people who don't care to know it, but they need to hear it. And they need to hear it from you. You're the ones who are in a better position than me or anybody else to tell them about what happened to indigenous people and what is still happening today. You're the one who can tell people who've never heard of the doctrine of discovery about the doctrine of discovery, who've never heard of Wounded Knee about Wounded Knee, who've never heard of boarding schools about boarding schools. More people need to know about this. And that is really, I think, the best way that any of us who live a far distance from reservations can do. There's tremendous racism going on right now in this country. And it's growing. It never went away, but it's growing. And I think the reason that it's growing is it's becoming increasingly validated. That people who have racist opinions feel more free to express them openly. And there are others that are around them who are either actively validating them or they're not saying anything. They're being quiet. Well, don't be quiet. Don't be quiet. When you see people who need to be informed, that's where you can step in and be of help. Because they're never going to hear it from me, because they're never going to come and listen to me talk. You're the ones who are in a better position to reach those who are resistant to any of this information. You're the ones who have friends and colleagues and family members who have never heard of this, or if they have heard of it, they don't give a damn about it. Or they may even dismiss it as nonsense or deny it altogether. And that's really the epitome of what white privilege is that those who enjoy white privilege don't have to care about any of this. They can just get up and walk away from it and dismiss it as nonsense. They can even deny that white privilege even exists. That's white privilege. So you all are the ones who can come to terms with that and need to within your own circle in which you live. And you can be very, very effective at addressing these issues as they come up. So the next time you hear somebody say something about indigenous people that hurts, let them know. Let them know how you think about it and how you feel about it. And hopefully you'll be giving them a different perspective that will make them stop in their tracks and think. that either they don't understand it fully, or if they're going to be so bold and outspokenly say something like that that's hurtful, that it's not going to necessarily be accepted as okay. So I can't do that with the people who are in your circles, but you can. So please do that, and that way you can help. Two more ways two more strategies that can be helpful that churches can do. One is repatriation. Well, let me just address the whole topic of reparations, first of all, because that usually comes up when people think about, well, what can we do? And then maybe reparations are the answer. And when we think of reparations, we usually think of money, financial compensation for the damage that was done. And in some instances, that's a helpful strategy. We do have a number of cases where treaties have been violated by the United States government, and tribes and their rights to land have been taken away from them. And we can't just forget about those. Treaties are important. According to the Constitution of the United States, treaties are the law of the land. And any other law, treaties supersede any other law. Treaties between sovereign nations are the law of the land, according to our Constitution. So we can't just pretend that these treaties that have been violated don't exist anymore. They are real issues, and they have to be settled in the courts. And they will be. But that's a long process, and it's a complicated process. And as someone who's tried to get involved in that a little bit on the activism level, I know how painstakingly frustrating it can be. So what are some other options? What are some other options with regard to responding? Well, okay, one of them is repatriation. Repatriation involves the remains of indigenous boarding school students being returned home, which is important for cultural and spiritual closure. So that cemetery that you saw the photos of at Carlisle, most of those graves are still there, and the remains of those children are still in those graves. They have not come home yet. And because they have not come home yet, their boarding school experience continues. They have not left the boarding school. And they won't until they're home to rest in the land of their ancestors. So what can we do to make that process happen? Well, there are churches that have become involved with it. With regard to Carlisle, there have been two Episcopal Church organizations that have gotten involved. The first one is the Episcopal Church on the Oneida Reservation in Wisconsin. The Oneida, incidentally, when they were in New York, before they went to Wisconsin, were the first tribe to encounter Episcopal missionaries after the Episcopal Church was founded. And it was under the direction of John Henry Hobart, who was one of the first bishops of New York, back when the Diocese of New York, I think, was the entire state or something like that. Went to Wisconsin. And Holy Apostles mission has been there since the middle of the 19th century. Wonderful congregation, very strong congregation. They were approached by the families of 3 Oneida children who, when they were at Carlisle, died and were buried there, and they wanted to bring their ancestors home. And so Holy Apostles, along with the Oneida tribe, the families, initiated a process with the Department of the Army, because that's the auspices that oversees that. Carlisle's under the auspices of the Department of the Army. Initiated a process to exhume the remains and repatriate them back to the Oneida Reservation. And it was a lengthy process, but they were successful in doing it. The church was very helpful. And so when they came home, they had a funeral for them at Holy Apostles Episcopal Church. And I attended that funeral. It was very moving. It was a packed house. The whole community was there. And they had the caskets of the 3 children at the front of the church. And we did a Book of Common Prayer funeral for them. A number of people spoke. And then one of the children was buried in the Episcopal Church cemetery. And then the other 2 were buried at the Oneida Tribal Cemetery. And so they finally were able to come home after all those years. And the Episcopal Church helped to make it happen. Where did I put my, there we go. And one of them was Ophelia Paulus. The Paulus family is a well-known family on the Oneida Reservation and in the church at Holy Apostles to this day. And Ophelia was a Carlisle student who died in 1891 and was buried at the cemetery at Carlisle and then returned home on June 30th, 2019. And that's her tombstone at the Episcopal, at the Holy Apostles Cemetery. So that's one possibility. The Rosebud Area Mission in the Diocese of South Dakota also was involved in a repatriation process at Carlisle a couple of summers ago, and that resulted in, I think, 7 Rosebud Sioux Carlisle students brought back home to the Rosebud Reservation for burial. This is really, really important to Indigenous people. It really is. When we die, we have to be in the land of our ancestors. We have to be with them, because until that happens, we haven't completed our journey. Our journey is still in process. And it makes sense that the church would be involved in something like this. This very, very much fits with our mission as ministers of the gospel. Another way of doing it, let me see if we have, okay. Another way of doing something that you can start doing now, if you haven't already, is writing land acknowledgments. Land acknowledgments. How many of you belong to congregations that have done land acknowledgments? In LA, okay, but not here yet, okay. How many of you have seen a land acknowledgement or heard it? Yeah. A land acknowledgement is simply acknowledging the tribal people who lived on the land upon which the church and the diocese currently exists. An acknowledgement, it names their name, who they were, acknowledges that they lived there, that this is their home, and that their home was taken from them, or they were deported or moved out of their home. And then there should be something in the land acknowledgement about how we give thanks for them, and that we want to be instruments of justice and reconciliation in the world for all people. It really doesn't have to be anything more than that. It can be really simple. It can be just a few sentences. Or it can be really, really elaborate, depending on what you want to do. But the point is, draw attention to the tribe that was once here, that this was their home and what happened to them. You know, say their name. Get people talking about them in the hopes that that will lead to further discussions, and that those further discussions will lead to some type of action or some type of response. So it all has to begin with acknowledgement and the mention, saying the name, and telling the story of what happened. Because until we do that, we're not going to get anywhere. That is the starting point. And it's just a starting point. It's not intended to be everything that you do, but it's intended to start a process of getting your congregation to having conversations. There's a belief among Indigenous people that we're never really dead and gone until people stop talking about us. So don't stop talking about us. And then see where it leads from there. There are a number of possibilities. Maybe you might be interested in repatriation. Maybe you might be interested in reaching out to a local tribe. Maybe you might be interested in doing all you can to teach your congregation and your families and your friends and your neighbors about Indigenous people and our history. I mean, those are all reparation possibilities. You don't have to pack up your bags and move to Navajo land and live in a tent for 20 years in order to help. You can do it right here at home. I mean, I could talk for a long time about that, but you're sitting on a very uncomfortable pew bench, so. Now, let's just step aside here and consider something about being Indigenous and Christian. You may wonder, why would an Indigenous person be interested in being Christian, given everything that's happened? And the fact of the matter is that many are not. Many are not. And we have to accept that if someone is not interested in us and our message. Remember, I said there's going to be a historically based mistrust of churches and church people. And so as much as we may want to help and talk about Jesus and talk about reconciliation, sometimes the best thing to do is not do that. Or at least not in that way. I'm not an expert on the 12 steps of recovery groups, but I think there is one step, and I'm not sure which one it is, but it calls for the person in recovery to make amends with those people that they may have harmed while they were drinking or using, to try to repair the damage, or at least acknowledge the damage that was done and express remorse for it. It's one of the steps. Unless to do so would cause more harm than good. Unless to do so would cause more harm than good. And that has to do with if you're approaching somebody that you've harmed in the past, perhaps you've traumatized them, you probably don't want to approach them again because you may re-traumatize them and do more harm than good. So the best thing you can do in that situation is feel sorry that you did that, learn from your mistake, and move forward. Don't do more harm than good. And I think that's the situation that churches are in sometimes with Indigenous people. That sometimes distance is not such a bad thing. If to want to become involved would do more harm than good. Because we don't want to inflict our agenda upon Indigenous people in their communities. They've had more than enough of that. So just be aware of that. There's some Indigenous people who just won't be interested in talking to you if you're a church person. So the reasons Indigenous people wanted to become Christian to begin with, going back to the 19th century, there were three central reasons. One was simply in order to survive. Churches did help Indigenous communities to survive, to keep them from starving to death, give them the resources they needed to live. Churches for a while operated the government agencies that provided supplies to Indigenous communities throughout the country. You were in a very precarious situation if you were an Indigenous person in the 19th century and didn't have a church affiliation. You probably weren't going to make it without a church affiliation. So that's why a lot of Indigenous people got baptized and became members of churches in order to survive. Another one was because our traditional ceremonies, our worship and spiritual expressions were made illegal because they were seen as threat to the government and militia. I don't know how this operates. This is kind of like back in the old days when you had a TV with an antenna, and sometimes you just whap it, and sometimes it would fix the picture, and sometimes it wouldn't. Our traditional religion were illegal. We couldn't openly and outwardly practice them, or we'd be arrested and thrown in jail. It was seen as subversive. And you know, that didn't change until 1978. With the American Indian Freedom of Religion Act in 1978, under President Jimmy Carter, made traditional indigenous religion, ceremonies, and spiritual expressions legal to publicly practice again. So before 1978, we needed something. We needed a way to publicly express our faith and do our ceremonies, because that's who we are as indigenous people. We're spiritual people. We see everything as spiritual. We're connected. We're related to the cosmos and the Great Spirit. And we have to find a way of, we have to have a way of demonstrating that and acting that out publicly. So before 1978, the only legal way of doing that was through Christian churches. And so that also was another reason that many of us became church members. And the Episcopal Church in particular was very good at providing, preserving the language, preserving the indigenous languages by offering translations of the Bible, the Book of Common Prayer, and the hymnal in indigenous languages, so that people could continue to speak their language and be in church. And because they couldn't speak their language in other venues, church had an appeal to them. They could do that there. And then another one was the universality of the Christ figure. Christ is a universal figure. And we believe Christ is a universal figure, right? Christ is not confined to any one culture or people or race or nation. Christ is universal. So what does that mean to indigenous people? Well, it means that we have to see Christ through the indigenous lens, and I've been talking about that a little bit throughout this presentation. See Jesus as a Lakota. I mean, why not? I mean, people have been seeing Jesus through their own cultural lenses all the time. How often has Jesus been seen through a European lens? Forever. So what does it mean to see Jesus through an indigenous lens? Well, it means to see Jesus as somebody who embodies indigenous values like generosity and compassion. And that's why I say that Jesus must have been a Lakota, because only a true Lakota would be so compassionate. Only a true Lakota would be so generous as to give his life. Only a true Lakota would be so brave as to go to his death with such humility and in such a respectful way and with honor and faith. Only a true Lakota would be so wise. Only a true Lakota would be so powerful as to perform miracles. So Jesus must have been a Lakota, as far as I'm concerned. That's what it means to see Jesus from an indigenous lens. And we're starting to do that. Now, there are some who claim that you can't do that. Remember Vine Deloria Jr., the son of Vine Deloria Sr., my predecessor, the first missioner? In his 2 books, Custer Died for Your Sins and God is Red. Custer Died for Your Sins came first, I think it was 1968, and God is Red was 1973. Vine Deloria said, it's not possible. Christianity is the antithesis of indigenous spirituality and belief, and look at what the church did to us. So you can't be authentically indigenous and authentically Christian. An impossible possibility. And there are a number of indigenous people who believe that. That's where they're at. Stephen Charleston, however, and I mentioned him before, the author of the book, The 4 Vision Quests of Jesus, says that it is possible And it does happen. You can be authentically Indigenous and authentically Christian if Jesus is seen as the native Messiah, fulfilling the teachings of traditional Indigenous ways, kind of as I've been trying to convey to you, seeing Jesus through an Indigenous lens. If you can do that, then you can be both. You can be both. So part of what that means is that for those of us who are Indigenous, we kind of have to, well, we more or less have to distance ourselves from the narrative of Israel and looking at Jesus as the Jewish Messiah and embracing Jesus as the native Messiah, the one who fulfills our narrative as Indigenous people, not the narrative of Israel. We would see the narrative of Israel as a narrative of colonization. Because who are the Indigenous people in the Old Testament? Who are the Indigenous people in the land of Palestine? It's not the people of Israel. It's the so-called enemies of Israel, the Canaanites, the Jebusites, the Perizzites, the Hittites, those who were to be driven out or put to death, those whose land was to be taken. So when an Indigenous person reads the Old Testament, we identify with them and not with Israel. So we simply have to find a different narrative, and it has to do with us, our history, and who we are. So that really is, it's central to the future of an Indigenous understanding and expression of the Christian faith, and it can exist within or outside of any particular denomination or church, understanding Jesus as the native Messiah. That's the only way forward for Indigenous people in the Christian church, because those three original reasons for us to belong to a church, the first two no longer apply. We don't need the church in order to survive, and our traditional expressions are no longer illegal. But we do need a Messiah and a Savior. And how can we understand that as Indigenous people? By the way, that's Bishop Mike Smith in the center there with the headdress. He's Potawatomi, originally from Oklahoma, and that's when he was Bishop of North Dakota. Mike Smith. I think he's assisting in Dallas now. So here's a visual, an artistic expression of Jesus as the native Messiah. And sometimes it's just as simple as seeing Indigenous faces in representations of biblical stories. Because we've seen that with European people all the time, haven't we? How many of us have seen a European Jesus? Blonde-haired, blue-eyed, fair-skinned, the Scandinavian Jesus. Jesus in European disciples. I mean, that's very quite commonplace. Well, how about seeing those faces from a different perspective? This is an icon called the Transfiguration. This is the Transfiguration. And it's Jesus in the center, and on one side on the left is Moses, and on the right is Elijah. So that's the future of Indigenous ministries, not just in the Episcopal Church, but in any denomination. Embracing Jesus as one of our own, because he was one of us. So the post-Columbian worldview has been all about survival, you know, just getting by. And we see that with Indigenous people. Just getting by from day to day is the best we can do. We're in crisis mode. It's so hard to plan for the future when you don't know if you're going to have one. This photo was taken by Rachel Tabor Hamilton, who's now the vice president of the House of Deputies in the Episcopal Church. She went to Standing Rock to stand with the tribe there during the Dakota Access Pipeline installation process. There were a number of clergy who went there from all over the country and were part of that solidarity. And she was in the river here, across into the other side, along with the others who were demonstrating. And you can see on the shore there are officers from a number of different law enforcement agencies who were there, who were starting to tear gas the water protectors. And what Rachel told me was that there was a young woman wearing a red shirt. You can see her there. And she took her red shirt off and held up her hands. And she said, "Don't tear gas me. Don't tear gas me. I love you. I want us all to love one another." And they tear gassed her, got her all over in her face so she couldn't see. And so she went down into the water to try to get it out of her eyes and to try to wash it away. And Rachel saw her trying to wash away all that toxic poison in a beautiful natural body of water, the water that gives life. And she said that was probably the most significant example of baptism that she'd ever seen. Baptism took on a whole new meaning for her as a result of that experience. So survival involves living in the face of nearly insurmountable personal and social issues and trauma. Really, the only way to do it is through resilience and hope. And we are a resilient people and a hopeful people. Otherwise, we wouldn't be here. We would have disappeared a long time ago. I want to show a couple of videos. We've got almost an hour left, so we should be in good shape. If I can get my mouse to work here. There we go. The first video I want to show is a video that it's a series, it's a collage of photos that were taken at the Indigenous boarding schools operated by the Episcopal Church in the Diocese of South Dakota. Just some depictions of some scenes, they're actual scenes of what it was like. Any thoughts about that? Any reactions?
Not many smiles.
Say it again, outside voice.
Not many smiles.
Not any smiles. Sometimes when people look at that, they say, well, what I see are children, young people who are well-fed and well-dressed and seem to be taken care of, and they're learning things. What's the problem? They're not learning their own thing. They're not with their families. All of those kids that you saw there were separated from their families, and they are probably as lonely as a person could be, missing their parents and grandparents and siblings. They don't want to be there. They had no choice to go. But there they are. So when Indigenous people see these, I mean, we understand it, we get it, we know what every one of those children was going through at that time. So as I said, there's a lot that we don't know about the Episcopal Church's boarding schools, but those are some images, actual photographs of what took place there. And then this next one, if technology will be our friend and work, is a video about Native voices. Some of you may have seen this before. And if you have, you're going to see it again.
That monumental meeting between Columbus and the Taínos Indians represented a meeting of the givers and the takers. Two worldviews clashing, and we're still struggling with the same issues of greed, selfishness versus love, kindness. In our worldview has always been looked down upon because we're considered weak. The Indian people have been confused ever since then. We don't know how we fit in the world. We still don't fit in. So we're still struggling with our identity in this world right now, to this day. We're confused about who we are.
Wherever there are Indigenous peoples, there is the experience of culture loss, of identity loss, of challenges constantly to even being federally recognized in this country. If you are interested, if you have a faith community of any kind that is interested in building relationships with Indigenous people, it is so crucial to understand the 400-year journey they've already been on that contributes to trauma and genuine cultural loss, as well as environmental loss and loss of diversity.
I'm an Episcopal priest. I can still go to a convention or a clergy conference or a meeting with other clergy. I still get the deer in the headlights look when I ask them about the doctrine of discovery. It's still something very far removed from the focus. And it's really sad that we have come to a place where we are actually making recognition of the doctrine of discovery, but we're not opening ourselves up to an interpretation that people who live closer to the land can bring to the way that we worship the God of all.
The stories of the lives of Indigenous people need to be told, and they need to be heard by the church and the world. During the pandemic, we had the opportunity to interview several Indigenous Episcopalians, clergy and lay, about their lives and about how they continue to be impacted by the doctrine of discovery.
It is painful for us to talk about and hear the history of the doctrine of discovery, but it's even more so in my mind painful because it seems to be referred to as a past problem. And I venture to say that even though for us the Episcopal
every time I get into a conversation about the doctrine of discovery, it hurts my heart because the church I love not only historically participated in it, but in its own ways, known and maybe unknown, it still does. I mean, wow, it only took 9 years after repudiating the doctrine of discovery to decide that they needed to train clergy about what that is.
I've always been inquisitive about why things happen and discovered that the research that was done on the Holocaust survivors, which discovered trauma. The trauma, a lot of those survivors suffered from trauma, and the symptoms, the manifestations were addictions, dysfunctional family, violence, all kinds of things that were identical to what I suffered in my family and what our people in general suffer.
Many ways to understand genocide, and again, the UN has defined that term in such a clear way to also refer to the slow impact over generations and of gradually taking away the opportunity for indigenous cultures to continue their identity across generations, to teach the next generation about indigenous life ways and food ways and how to live on the land in ways that are sustainable. We have indigenous communities that are really truly on the brink of extinction that is concurrent with species extinction. In the Pacific Northwest, that looks like the ongoing efforts and struggles to preserve salmon and the rights to waterways for traditional tribal use, because that's connected to the generational gifting of identity, of cultural ways, of language that expresses the reality of indigenous worldview and hunting, and all of it is so interconnected that it is impossible to just take one issue and look at it without looking at it within the context of indigenous experience.
I had a wonderful extended family on both sides of my family, my mother's side, my father's side. Wonderful aunts and uncles, wonderful experiences. But we also have suffered from trauma. I think it was mainly intergenerational trauma. My father, he drank, for the most part socially, but during the holidays he would overdo it, and we would have some conflict in the home. And over time, my folks started having marital problems. And by the time I was in high school, they were separated and divorced. I lost my mom. She was so distraught, she took her life. And so I was really struggling myself with my own identity, self-esteem. I learned that there was bipolar disease in my family, and that it shows up in certain people. And I think my mother suffered from it. Eventually, one of my sons suffered from it, and he suffered an overdose in 2007. Another tragedy. My wife and I divorced. We had problems. I was drinking at the time.
My 18-year-old daughter was a victim of driver shooting in Los Santos. And when I went to the hospital, she was just lying very silent. And I said, he said, she'll never come out of this, the doctor decided she'll never come out of it, she's brain dead. And so I had special ceremonies for her when I was crying and held her hand. And I said, Sister, I don't want to see you like this. But if you have to go, I understand. And she squeezed my hand. was her answer of, I've got to go. I'll see you in time. My son, he was a victim of the chokehold in California that was committed by a police officer. I won that case twice by jury trial, and then last time it went to the state. They offered me a large amount of money, and I refused it because I felt like this isn't going to bring it down. And it's so hurtful to think that I exchanged money for my son, so I never did. But if it wasn't for my faith, I'm not sure how I would come through it.
I've had two sisters die. My youngest sister, Beverly, died in 2016. She had an enlarged heart. She never knew about it. She worked in Minneapolis for a catering company. She went and took a bathroom break and never came back. And they went in. They checked on her, and by then she was gone. Her heart just stopped. And then my sister Karen, next to me in age, died December of 2020. The coronavirus got her. So I don't much like the coronavirus. I don't think anybody does. But in between there, I have two sons, Larry and Calvin Peacock. They died together in a car accident in 1994, a month after my youngest brother died. And most recently, last year, my husband Dean died April 9th of 2020. Thinking about my life and the people that died within my family, I'm still blessed, and God has taken care of me. After my sons died, I was angry with God, and I quit going to church for 9 years. I never stopped praying. I still believed in prayer, I believed in God. But it took me 9 years to just keep praying, and God never gave up on me. That He was there, brought me through, and He still does.
Some of the kids went to Wrangell Institute in 1954, I think. We took a lot of kids out of the school. I was 15 years old, and they put them on the plane to Wrangell, and they said I was too old for Wrangell. So, and so I just stayed home and cried. The word was over for me. And when the kids went away, they put a He said in the evening you could hear the children crying, you know. And some of the older ones crying would be big sister or big brother to them. And that helped a little but not much.
My father didn't say much about his experiences in the boarding school in Pine Ridge, especially the difficult ones. Like many of our elders, he would accentuate the positive, and he would say that all in all, it was a good experience. But I remember him telling me about how, after he was taken to the school to live as a young child, every night after supper he would go down to the front gate and he'd wait. Every evening, he said, I would wait for someone to come and take me home. He said he did that for about a year, and then he realized whoever he was waiting for wasn't coming.
I grew up as a Native woman with the words boarding school, assimilation, genocide, hearing about kill the Indian, save the man. I was just hearing from that, and then to hear now all this that's going on about all the grave sites,
church is definitely part of the spread of colonialism, the upholding of this idea of empire, and so this goes beyond just looking into your boarding school records that the Episcopals have and saying, we ran these boarding schools and these are the things that happened and we're really sorry and we really want to move forward. But to take it a step further and say, we are here to dismantle systems of white supremacy and racism, and we're going to start by acknowledging the genocide of schools that we ran.
It's also worth mentioning that within white cultural traditions, the idea of boarding school, even the most fancy, highfalutin boarding school, and you think of the traditions in England and like that, a lot of the philosophy is still the same. We would want to break down the student and then reform it. And maybe that's culturally acceptable in certain white cultures, but in indigenous cultures, that's unthinkable. We can't imagine that the absolute worst thing to do is to remove someone from their family. Now, the great-great-grandchildren, and even more greats, as they carry the weight from their ancestors, they are experiencing their own traumas. That's a lot to carry. We owe it to them to expose our hearts and to begin to heal and to let the sunshine and the fresh air into our hearts to heal and to heal the pain of our ancestors. This is how we begin to heal historical trauma. The idea of dying alone is so unthinkable to us. The idea of a child having to die alone is even more so. So the idea of bringing these children home really must be part of this discussion. Whenever possible, we must do that, both for the sake of the souls of those children who may or may not have crossed over, but for the sake of the souls of the survivors and the descendants. This is imperative. So regardless of what discussions on reparations will come, and they will come, and they must come, this has to be a part of it.
Years ago, I had to go through the process of getting sober. I had alcohol abuse issues. I'm an alcoholic. And one of the pieces of the work that I really found successful was digging into that heritage and studying some of the more traditional ways of seeing the world. Did a vision quest with a Cherokee guide out in the Big Bend, and had a powerful experience out there. Something that just really set me in a place of understanding me. That experience gave me what I have to be an Episcopal priest. That experience was my experience of seeing Creator's vision for my life.
My life changed, our lives changed, and sometimes it wasn't always for the good. And so I realized that in 1973 that I must change my life. And thank God for the elders who have their spirituality with them. And
doing some lay reading, just reading on Sunday mornings, the Old Testament, New Testament, and sometimes the Psalms for you. And it just got more interesting, and I thought, I think I'd like to do a little bit more with Father Cecil or a priest to help out more. I felt joy in being able to do something, and I think the pain that I had from my son's dying hasn't gone away, but it's lessened, and kind of skipping ahead of it. Probably the greatest challenge I had after I became a priest was Easter, the first Easter, and after that. My sons died on Easter Sunday in 1994. And so after I became a priest and I had to celebrate, it was not a good choice of words, had to celebrate. When I celebrated Easter Sunday, the first time I was going to celebrate Easter Sunday, I started Ash Wednesday praying for God's strength, to give me the strength to make it through that first Easter that I celebrated with the people at the four churches, because that was the morning my sons died. And God helped me. I made it through. And after that, it just became a ritual. I started praying Ash Wednesday. And then by the time Easter Sunday came, I could celebrate with people the resurrection. And it was joyous then. But, so that was probably my greatest challenge, was being able to celebrate Easter Sunday with my congregations, since my sons died on Easter Sunday. But after a while, it became, what a day, what a glorious day for them to go.
We were always told by the old people that this is a spiritual world, first and foremost. And it just happens to be operating in the physical world. But it does not always come forth. You can't see the happenings of the spirit world. But it is happening. It is part of this world. It's an integral part of this world. You have to stay open to understand and see that, make that connection. And when you do, oh boy, God the Father, Jesus Christ becomes real in so many ways, and prayers become powerful. What makes a prayer powerful is the faith behind it, and the old people knew that.
The thing that brings me the most joy is when I'm standing out in the middle of creation, recognizing that there is so much more going on than my head can even hold. There is so much relationship, and all of a sudden, the problems I have, the struggles I have, that sort of thing, don't feel so insurmountable.
We had a Sundance chief, Jensen Jack. He taught me so much. He used to say, you go to church Sunday, you pray. Me, I pray all day. He said, I say thank you 12, in our language, 12 all day. 12, fresh air, beautiful day, 12, food, water, It's to talk to me about it.
The book of Genesis tells us everything we need to be and exist in this life, Creator made before Creator made us. Everything was already in place to help us. And somewhere along the way, we decided not to be grateful for that. We decided to exploit it.
Our bishop, Hayashi, gave a wonderful sermon. He asked us, he said, the opposite of love? And of course, most of us were thinking hate. So I know you're thinking hate. He said, well, he said, think about it. When you love, You want to give. You want to share. And if you don't love, what do? And then all of a sudden I sat up, oh, that's right. We take. We take. Instead of give, we take. We rob, we feed. We're selfish. That's the opposite of love. Greed and selfishness.
There is so much focus on this Anglican ethos. So much focus on that, and yet there is such room for learning and growth and development if we could learn to accept that there are other ways of seeing the same story that even make it more powerful.
It wasn't hard for our Native people to become Episcopalians because they were already strong spiritually. For instance, in our Native tradition, we burn food. We burn, like when someone dies and stuff like that. And then I started reading the Bible, and then I learned about the overpass. When the angels came and put a blood by the door, and I thought, oh, wow. You know what, when someone dies or whatever, we put fish tail over the door. It keeps the family healthy. That was our way of leaving the overpass. People don't do that too much anymore because, you know, they learned way back then that our ways were not good, they tell us.
Our worldview has always been looked down upon because we're considered weak. Columbus' interpretation of those chains of kindness and love was, oh, they're weak. We can take advantage of them. They have gold, they have mineral, they have food. We can take advantage of all those things. And yet people have been confused ever since then. We don't know how we fit in the world. It's always like we've been non-fitters ever since. We still don't fit in. We don't make good businessmen, managers, or corporate leaders. Because that's not our culture, that's not who we are. So we're still struggling with our identity in this world right now, to this day. We're confused about who we are. I say, if we look deeply into our soul and find out who we are, we can make a great contribution to this world.
We have 15 minutes. Time really flew, didn't it? Anybody have any questions, comments? Yes, you'll have to use your outside voice.
Is that film available on the church website?
That is available on my office's webpage. If you go to the Episcopal Church's website, and then there's you'll find a link to Indigenous Ministries, and that's where it is. You'll find it there. And a lot of other videos, too. Yes? Is there a good way to give money to Indigenous organizations? Oh, yeah. Well, there are a number of Indigenous organizations that have websites that you can donate to. You can go on the website and find out about the work that they're doing. And that's what I would recommend. One such organization is the former CEO of the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I know that's a long title, but the Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, which does a lot of work with regard to boarding school issues and survivors and repatriation. That's a very worthy organization that I would recommend. Yeah, you want to go with established 501c3 nonprofits. When I was, one of my first positions after I was ordained was I was in the mission field in South Dakota. I was on the Yankton Sioux Reservation, where I was in charge of 4 congregations. And every now and then we would get these big boxes of old clothes and shoes that would be sent to us from congregations out on the East Coast, New England and other places. And they thought that they were doing good and helping. But whenever I would offer these up, folks, they would look at them and they'd say, well, I don't want to wear that. You know, look at these shoes, they're all worn out. And it was, and on the one hand, it was funny, but on the other hand, it was actually kind of humiliating that people would think that we would want their discarded stuff when we don't want discarded stuff. I mean, we're more than that. So honestly, I just ended up disposing of a lot of it because nobody wanted it. The Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. Yes?
Some of our tribes have industries, my tribe in particular, has regenerative farming. It's the island tribe of Kansas, Nebraska. We sell honey, and you can go online and buy that. That's really a great way to support your local tribes. People get confused when they see, they may go to a powwow or an art show, and they see turquoise or the beads, and they think, I'm culturally appropriating, it's beautiful, but I don't want to buy it. We want you to buy it and wear it. It's appreciation, not appropriation. So there are ways of being supported and being an advocate and being an ally.
Yeah, thank you for mentioning that. Yeah, if you're ever an Indigenous gathering, a tribal gathering, a powwow or anything like that, and there are vendors there that are selling Indigenous-made jewelry, by all means buy it. If it's Indigenous-made within the community there, there's some very gifted artists who do good work and need the money, and that's why they're doing it. So, yeah, don't hesitate to buy it and wear it. It's not appropriation under those circumstances. What is appropriation is if you go to a tourist stop in South Dakota, like Wall Drug, and you end up buying something that looks indigenous. It has chicken feathers all over it and a made in Japan stamp on the back. That's what you don't want to do. But appropriation really is a sensitive issue for Indigenous people because we're really protective of the things that we have left, the things that we still have, because so much has been taken away from us. And one of the things that we really are guarded with has to do with our spirituality, our spiritual expressions. Our spirituality is really one of the main things that we have left. So when we see non-Indigenous people and non-Indigenous congregations trying to do something Indigenous just because they think it's cool stuff to do, but if there are no Indigenous people in the congregation and no Indigenous people are initiating it, then that's appropriation. That's appropriation. I had a horrific experience once where I went to a congregation in suburban Minneapolis, an all-white, or at least it appeared to be an all-white congregation. I never knew it to have any association with Indigenous people or tribes. Tried to do an Indigenous service one Sunday. And they didn't know I was going to be there. I just happened to drop in and visit. And oh, it was painful to listen to white people try to pronounce and mispronounce indigenous words and not know how to do the four directions prayer correctly. And the reason that they did it was they wanted to try to be more inclusive. So their intentions were good, but they just didn't know what they were doing. Now, if they had indigenous people within the congregation who were requesting that or wanting to do it and helping with it, that would be a different thing altogether. That would not be appropriation. But if there are no indigenous people in your congregation, don't try to do something like that. And incidentally, there's nothing wrong with being white. So if you go home with nothing else, just remember that. There's nothing wrong with being white. You got to be who you are. You know, be genuine. That's what Jesus taught. That's one of the things that Jesus taught in, what was it, the Sermon on the Mount, I think it was, where he said, it's translated in a really unfortunate, he says, you must be perfect as your Father in heaven is perfect. Well, the Greek word in that is teleos, and it doesn't mean perfect in the sense of being flawless. It means perfect in the sense of being whole, mature, and authentic. Being the real deal. Being the genuine article. Don't be a phony, is what Jesus is saying. And so I think that's really important for each one of us. Yes?
That's what I noticed about schools is that when they were in the school uniforms or the dress that they had been put in, they seemed they almost looked like they were in costume. You could tell
They were.
They were uncomfortable in clothing and like, this is not me.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And all I could think about was those boys walking in those nice, neat tie shoes and thinking, those must be really uncomfortable.
Some of the photos that you saw in that montage were from the boarding schools in South Dakota, were taken at a reenactment of the Thanksgiving, the first Thanksgiving myth. And so they actually had indigenous children, some of them dressing up in indigenous costumes, which is what they weren't authentic regalia, and then some of them dressing up as pilgrims in pilgrim costumes and trying to reenact the mythological first Thanksgiving. Really painful to watch, but that's some of the stuff that happened at the boarding schools. Some of the stuff that happened at the boarding schools that my parents told me were the children were taught to hate other racial groups. That white people were good, indigenous people needed to be more white, and then all other racial groups were bad. So they were taught that, and they were taught racist songs to sing in music class about other racial groups. It was just really atrocious. But that was part of the assimilation process, too. Any other questions? Yes.
Not a question, but I wanted to share a little story. So Anna Frank, who you saw in that video, I know her, I met her, I spent time with her, and I admired her jacket, and the next day I got it. So I learned quickly, don't say you like something, or else it comes to you. And so she says, is there anything else you like? No, ma'am. No, ma'am.
Thank you, yes. Anna was the Athabascan elder who was in the video. Dear woman, she's the one at the end who talked about the overpass instead of the Passover. When we were putting this together, we were thinking about maybe we should edit that out, but I said, no, leave it in. That's Anna. That's how she talks. And it's the overpass. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so I have a question for everyone in the room because I have a hypothesis going as a history teacher. Can you raise your hand if you learned about the doctrine of discovery when you were in school? And say Joe did. And say, I think there's a shift here. Right, I mean positive or negative. A handful of people? Okay. In college, I would say, how many of you learned Manifest Destiny in a positive? I'm positive your high school history book had that picture. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. You know, what I've discovered, I've done these presentations on reservations to Indigenous people, and many of them had not heard of the doctrine of discovery because it had never been taught to them by anybody, and of course you can understand why it wouldn't be. But they would say, well, I've never heard of the doctrine of discovery, but I know all about what happened as a result. That's the story of my life, and I live it every day. So that part I really do know. Yes? Thank you. God bless you. Palamia is thank you. Palamia. And I thank you all for being here. Some of you have driven long distances, and it's a great honor, and I've really enjoyed being here with you all. So thank you. Palamia. Thank you. Wow. Wow, thank you. As I said, I usually don't get applause after I speak. So thank you.
So again, thank you all for being here. This has been recorded. The parts of the breaks will be edited out, and this will be available online sometime soon. I'm looking at Zach, sometime soon. But I also have 2 versions of this from the Diocese of Los Angeles that Mary Christ, who helped work on that film, did. And so that she did for us in LA. So we've got multiple options for people to see. Father Mark. Oh, is the PowerPoint presentation available? Yes. Yes, and we can put it on the website we'll put it on the website with the video. I think that's the easiest way, okay? Again, thank you all for being here. Go in peace to love and serve the Lord.